Chapter 1285 Forget about leaving. All of you. Although there weren't many supplicants in the Storm Cathedral in the evening, Klein chose to appear on a corridor that led to the garden so as to avoid conflict. How magical! Pasha muttered to herself as she looked at the settling surroundings. Roy suppressed his emotions and looked around. If that chief shepherd comes to the cathedral to tide over the curfew, he could be somewhere like this. If one isn't worried about accumulating the number of crimes they commit, an angel has too many ways to fool the average person, Klein said casually. I'll send you to the other cathedrals later. Try to stay in places with glass windows and mirrors. Once you discover any outsiders that might be from Faisak, find an opportunity to draw a symbol. Before he could finish his sentence, his head suddenly turned as he looked at the door leading to the garden in the prayer hall. A figure over 6 meters tall slowly walked out. He was wearing a long black robe with white edges, one completely filled with his bulging muscles. This was an old white-bearded man wearing a square hat. His eyes were pale blue, and he had few wrinkles. He had an aura of superciliousness. The chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat, Larian. Without needing to identify the figure, Klein's spiritual intuition told him that the person opposite him was an angel, the reason for coming to the cathedral. Larian glanced at him and said in surprise, "It's not Ariana." He immediately restrained his expression and said rather indifferently, "Appears to be her helper. You can tell her that I've reached an agreement with 0-02, which has come alive to a certain degree. I'll give up sealing it in exchange for permission to leave. And y'all will stay here, enduring the changes in the rules and the increasingly stricter laws until y'all are completely dead." The chief shepherd didn't seem to be worried that Klein would stop him at all. This was because when he spoke, his body was rapidly aging. The surface of his skin quickly became covered in wrinkles, with aging spots appearing on it, dripping with a rotting liquid. In just a few blinks of an eye, Larian looked as though he was about to evaporate into thin air from his aging. Then, he turned into a pool of rotten liquid that completely evaporated. The impact of this scene sent shivers down Biles and company's spines. They felt as if their minds were about to go haywire and that their emotions were about to collapse. This was just like the countless tiny worms that had crawled out from the wound on Mr. Magician's wrist when he reformed his hand. It was just as terrifying and harrowing. A strange ability. It has something to do with Twilight? Klein didn't have any intention of stopping Larian. He only nodded in thought. In the spirit world corresponding to Belton, Larian's figure appeared and returned to normal. Right on the heels of that, as though he could control spirit world creatures, he passed through an invisible barrier and escaped the many restrictions of Belton City. But just as Larian was about to begin tearing through space, everything suddenly darkened and he saw a seamless patch of dark cloth. It was like a wall that blocked Larian's path. Larian cautiously stopped his actions, looked up at the infinitely high area where the 7 pure lights were. However, he could only see an illusory curtain hanging down from it, enveloping the spirit world of the area corresponding to Belton, isolating it and creating an independent world. At the same time, Larian's intuition as a demon hunter had told him that the barrier formed by the curtain was extremely strong and difficult to break through. He needed to spend a lot of time and effort to do so. To this chief shepherd, what was happening had a strange comical feeling, making him unable to contain his rising anger. This was akin to him finally finding the key to a secret chamber after countless hardships. Just when he had the chance to open the door and leave before others could, he was surprised to find that there was an additional lock on the chamber's door, a rather sturdy lock. It lacks a sense of realism. It's a projection from the historical void. It's fraud. No, it's outside of Belton City, out of the law's jurisdiction. This historical projection should have existed here a long time ago. It can't last more than 2 minutes, so it will dissipate on its own. Larian quickly regained his composure, allowing his anchors and inclination towards madness to once again form a balance. In the corridor of the Storm Cathedral, Roy and company finally recovered. They turned their heads to look at Mr. Magician, who was in no way inferior to the angel from before. Pasha hesitated for a moment before saying fearfully, He seems to have escaped. This way, they wouldn't be able to obtain any information about 0-02's location. Relying on a carpet search would be too late. Furthermore, no one present knew what the terrifying sealed artifact looked like. Describing it as a book made it too wide a scope. I can only think of other solutions, Klein replied with a smile. Do you have any suggestions? He had been waiting for Larian to return and negotiate with him, but he realized that the chief shepherd would rather wait in the spirit world for the curtain historical projection to disappear. And although he could enter the spirit world as well, he was unable to break through the strange barrier created after 0-02's law changing. As he spoke, Klein seriously considered other solutions and made a few worms of spirit control his body. He spoke to the Beyonders beside him in an attempt to find inspiration through their discussion. We should take the initiative to create a contradiction that's similar to what happened to Biles so that we'll be in a relatively safe state. Only by doing so will we be able to begin our search. Phil brought up the idea that he had previously had. Pasha shook her head. But if we use this kind of contradiction to do something, 0-02 will definitely add new rules to resolve the corresponding problems. But this can still buy us some time, Phil emphasized. That is something that can be done, Roy agreed, and added, but our focus should be on finding 0-02. Perhaps we can create some contradiction that will make it expose its location. As for what kind of contradiction could achieve such an effect or how to create it, he hadn't come up with an idea. In the event of a contradiction, new rules will be added to resolve it. Klein wore a smile as he listened silently. Sparks flew as his thoughts crashed in his mind. At that moment, aqueous light appeared on the surface of the magic mirror in his hand as silver words appeared. Pasha, do you want to know what the new content on the notice board is? The mirror directly asked me. Why did it ask me directly? Pasha was taken aback for a moment before she hurriedly nodded and answered, yes. The aqueous light in the silver mirror quickly returned and presented a scene of the notice board. There were 2 new rules. In compliance with the curfew order, the various cathedrals will shut down early. All hotels shall only accommodate guests who have registered their identities, Phil panicked. Where do we go now? He had no idea how he, Roy, and Pasha could escape the punishment. Roy and Pasha exchanged looks as various thoughts surged through their minds, but none of them were viable. At this moment, Klein, who had been maintaining his silence, smiled and cast his gaze at Biles. Where's your house in Belton? A rental apartment on 18 Maple Street, but that apartment has already collapsed from the blast of an artillery shell, Biles answered, slightly perplexed. Klein smiled and said, you can make a wish to return your house to its original state. I'll grant it. Can that be done? Although the magical magician had healed Phil's severed hand with unbelievable powers, Biles still felt that it would be much more difficult to restore a collapsed house to its original state. After all, Dr. Weber, the military doctor who Roy mentioned, was capable of doing that. Of course. Klein smiled and reminded him. Make haste. At that moment, the supplicants in the cathedral were leaving one after another. Biles didn't dare to delay any further as he immediately said, I wish that my house will return to its original state. All right. Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. Your wish has come true. While Roy and company were in a daze, Klein activated teleport once again and brought them to 18 Maple Street. He stopped outside a 2-bedroom room. Biles stared blankly at the familiar wooden door in front of him. Subconsciously, he reached out his right hand and pushed it open. The cupboard, gas stove, bunk bed, wooden table covered in oil, and the messy old newspapers strewn everywhere were reflected in his eyes as his eyes immediately moistened. Before the war broke out, he often saw his mother busying herself around the coal stove when he came back from the mines. His father and brother either made use of the time to do some repairs or helped to handle the spoiled parts of the fruit and vegetables. They did some of the work that could be taken home. His young niece learned the alphabet from old newspapers under the guidance of her mother while she put together matchstick boxes. Although such a life was tough and didn't have any ability to avoid risks, it was still a wonderful memory for Biles. It was many times better than the dark mine paths, heavy oars, and the whipping from the supervisors. But now, even this tiny bit of beauty was completely destroyed. Aren't you going to invite us in? Phil stood at the door, not daring to trespass on the private property. After snapping back to his senses, Biles hurriedly said, Please come on in. After entering the unoccupied house, Klein pulled a chair that could break at any moment and sat down. He then fell silent. Roy, Pasha, and the others did not dare to disturb the gentleman as they waited quietly by his side. After 20 to 30 seconds, Klein suddenly looked around and said with a smile, I have an idea that requires verification. Who wants to work with me on this? I'll do it, Roy replied without hesitation. Klein smiled and replied, Afterward, don't truthfully answer the questions. I'm looking for the loopholes hidden in 0-02's rules. Roy nodded and said, that wouldn't be an issue. Klein immediately took out the magic mirror and said to Roy, ask it a question. Roy thought for a moment and said, where can I find my next potion? A scene appeared on the surface of the silver mirror. It was the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat, Larian, who was pacing around the spirit world. Roy's expression instantly stiffened. Then he heard Mr. Magician say, it's your turn to answer its question. Remember, don't give it the correct answer. Roy hurriedly reined in his thoughts and looked back at the mirror. He saw that the mirror had already transformed into Mr. Magician himself, and a few more lines of blood-like text appeared. Who did you give your first time to? Roy instantly recalled the past as his face flushed red. Then, he answered according to Mr. Magician's instructions. I'm not sure. Eli. The blood-colored text on the silver mirror instantly condensed into the terrifying words. Pa! A bolt of lightning appeared out of nowhere and struck Roy. Roy convulsed in pain as his body was charred black. His hair stood on end, but his life wasn't truly in danger. Biles, Pasha, and Phil were all startled, unsure what had just happened. At this moment, Klein looked around and smiled. Look, the mirror didn't get punished for voluntarily causing harm. A real opportunity lies in here. Chapter 1286 New Applications of Old Methods. A real opportunity. Pasha, Biles, and Phil were delighted to hear this. It was as if they had finally seen the light after searching for a long time in the dark night. What kind of opportunity? Roy blurted out from his dazed state. Klein wasn't in a rush. He smiled and said, did you guys not notice? There is no clear indication on the notice of who the enforcer is. As a keyboard warrior in the past, Klein had always claimed to be a jack of all trades. Furthermore, he had interacted with many lawyers in his life and had an Earl of the Fallen Marionette before. He had the basic foundation needed when it came to the law and rules. That's right, the announcement only mentioned a new consul, and it's not clear who the enforcer is. We encountered an invisible justiciar previously. Pasha and the others revealed a thoughtful expression. Upon seeing this, Klein reached out his hand and stroked the surface of the magic mirror as though he was combing an animal. Under normal circumstances, everyone has tacitly acknowledged that the police and the authorities responsible for dealing with supernatural cases enforce the law. This is confirmed through a series of legal documents or the corresponding public knowledge. But this time, the rules haven't reached such an airtight level. If we say that the rules are built on a blank slate composed of the original laws, directives, and rules, then we should have seen the police, the Nighthawks, or the mandated punishers when we committed crimes, but that's not the case. In other words, the corresponding enforcer is indeed vague. Pasha, who was the most knowledgeable among the four Beyonders, thought for a moment before saying, perhaps, the law enforcer is an abstract concept. Or perhaps, it is tacitly equivalent to the new consul. The latter isn't clear either. It doesn't make it clear who the new consul is. This way, it can be anyone. The former isn't obliged to make it known, Klein simply replied. Phil frowned and said, but we can't enforce the law like the citizens. The corresponding authority is determined by eliminating groups via labels, Klein explained with a smile. Foreigners are targets of ostracization and pursuit, so they obviously lack the required law enforcement rights. As for the citizens, they only have it when dealing with foreigners. This is confirmed through the notice. Without waiting for Roy and Biles to speak, Klein continued. So, I just used the contradiction hidden in this matter to get Roy to test it. The result is exactly as I predicted. First of all, the magic mirror isn't a foreign living being. Neither is it a local. It's just an item with a certain level of intelligence. It cannot be placed into any particular group. This way, in a situation where the law enforcer isn't clear, those who aren't part of the elimination process have the right to enforce the law. Secondly, it had punished a foreigner. Those notices imply that all who deal with foreigners are law enforcers. Finally, the magic mirror itself has the rules of punishment. Before this rule is announced to be illegal, it has the right to punish others. Based on the 3 points above, I believe that 0-02 should be in a lot of conflict right now. Next, it will definitely issue a new law to clearly determine the main body of law enforcement, to mend the loopholes in this area. Once the main body of the law enforcement is revealed, it will contain a lot of information. It will help us lock onto the target. Heh. If 0-02 uses a method of adding prohibitions, it will definitely restrict itself, as it shares the same attributes as the mirror. This is definitely not its first choice. At that moment, Roy Pasha, and the others, who were listening to Klein's recount, suddenly had the feeling that he was a knowledgeable and highly intelligent person. Could it be that Mr. Magician is a wise man who likes to travel among the commoners in legends? The four Beyonders each made similar but different guesses. At this moment, the magic mirror in Klein's hand emitted a misty aqueous light. Amidst the aqueous light, the silver mirror's surface showed the notice board. 2 more lines appeared on the bottom of the original piece of paper. All law enforcement must be carried out by the Trunsoist Brass Book or the group it authorizes. Any private rules can't surpass the official decree. Trunsoist Brass Book. This is the full name of 0-02? The opportunity is here. Klein's expression turned serious as he entered cogitation. He had forced 0-02 to clarify the main law enforcement to obtain more information so as to further understand the situation of the terrifying sealed artifact. And based on Klein's deduction, 0-02 was more or less related to a particular Sapphira, just like how he was back when he had yet to become the owner of Sapphira Castle. Therefore, furthering his understanding of it would inevitably result in reverse corruption, thereby establishing a certain connection. To a certain extent, the Sapphira was equivalent to a great old one, outer deity, or the cosmos. Back then, Klein had used such mysticism knowledge to lock onto the location of dark demonic Wolf Kotor. Now, he was using it in the opposite direction. From his point of view, 0-02 was definitely more corrupted by a Sapphira than him. After all, sealed artifacts were in a state of having lost control. This was why they needed to be sealed. Under such circumstances, further understanding of 0-02 would result in corruption. The reality proved Klein's hypothesis. And it was also because of this danger that he didn't show the new content presented by Rhodes to the four Beyonders. In cogitation, Klein quickly sensed that he had an invisible connection with a certain spot. The indescribable corruption was surging over. Ding! At the same time he flicked out a gold coin, he used Sapphira Castle's aura to cut off the connection and isolate the corruption. Immediately after, a clear image appeared in his mind. Klein grabbed the gold coin with his left hand. After the glove suddenly turned transparent, he instantly vanished from the room and appeared in a hall filled with bookshelves. On the side of the hall with floor-to-ceiling windows, there were many long rectangular tables. On one of them was a book bound by thin brass sheets. "I found you." A smile appeared on Klein's face. He made use of the brief connection to do a divination. Then, he relied on the attraction between Spherote to make the teleportation become abnormally precise. The law of convergence between Spherote would allow Klein to accidentally enter the library and discover the brass book. However, it might have happened 2 days later, 2 weeks later, or even 2 years later. It wouldn't happen in time to stop anything. Furthermore, this was under the prerequisite that 0-02 didn't do any corresponding interference or avoidance measures. Pah! The clothes on Klein's back suddenly cracked as blood-red strokes appeared. This was a punishment for trespassing into a public area. Whipping. Thankfully, this crime is very light. And I won't be punished for this crime for the next 1 or 2 minutes. The rules will give the trespasser time to withdraw. Klein immediately reached out and grabbed a few times in the void. He didn't really pull out the figure of the ascetic leader, Ariana. This was because, to a non-committal person, a historical projection was a form of fraud. He only used this method to send his location information to the servant of concealment. Due to the same reason, Klein dispersed the glove on his left hand. During this process, the brass book started flipping and displayed the rules. When one's rationality drops to 20% of its original value, there would be signs of losing control. Scholar of Yore has the ability to summon historical void projections. The success rate of summoning depends on the familiarity and friendliness of the target. The Trunsoist brass book is the most precious item. No living being is permitted to touch it. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. One is not allowed to change the condition of the Trunsoist brass book in any way. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. The rules made Klein's eyelids twitch. He felt his rationality constantly dropping. This caused the primordial one's mental brand in his body to become more active. The first part of the rules is presented in grayish-black, as though it's in a state that can't be changed. This requires 0-02 to awaken further? If it awakens to the extent of changing the rules in front, it'll be very terrifying. It might even reduce the success rate of my summonings, causing Beyonders to show signs of losing control if their rationality falls a little. With this we've fixed the problem of this variant of a seer being too strong. As expected of 0-02. It fully lives up to its serial number. The text behind is presented in silver. Does this mean that the rules can be altered or enhanced? I can't touch it. I can't change its state. That also means that I can't take it away, nor can I directly conceal this sealed artifact. Perhaps I can use the Staff of the Stars or the Box of the Great Old Ones to directly move this library into the cosmos and let 0-02 face those outer deities. But if the outer deities were to grasp this sealed artifact, the problem might be greater than it is now. Klein hesitated for a moment and didn't risk summoning his Grade 0 sealed artifact. The next second, he heard a smacking sound. The figure of Ariana's simple linen robe and tree bark belt was quickly outlined at his side. She was lashed by an invisible whip, leaving behind an obvious bloody mark. The first problem has been resolved. Now, we need to consider the second problem. That is how to seal this fellow, Klein said as he made haste. It wouldn't be long before he would suffer a second punishment. Ariana shook her head. The corresponding information has been destroyed. We can only resolve it through trial and error. That's a little dangerous. We don't know, but someone definitely knows. Klein's heart stirred as he made his spirit body leave his body and enter the spirit world. Through the invisible barrier created by 0-02. He said to the Church of the God of Combat's chief shepherd, Larian, who was waiting for the curtain to disappear, perhaps we can make a deal. You want the method to seal 0-02? Larian turned around and chuckled. Do you think I'll agree? Actually, I'm very puzzled. Why must you sacrifice yourself for the fallen god of combat? By joining the Church of Evernight, you can still be an angel, and you can also receive blessings. You can also live for a very long time. Klein didn't directly respond as he said. Larian's expression darkened as he said, a mythical creature without any pious faith wouldn't be able to understand me. As an evil god, isn't it normal for me to not be devout? Klein couldn't help but mutter inwardly. This was his humanity. Chapter 1287 Guidance. Seeing that Klein was momentarily at a loss for words, the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat, Larian, revealed a solemn expression. Furthermore, the fall of a deity is only temporary. He will eventually return and awaken using my body. Klein frowned slightly when he heard that. He didn't know whether the angel was having mental problems and wasn't far from losing control because of his shaken anchors, or if he was too affected by the God of Combat. In a certain sense, he had become his backup. Ignoring the sequence 0 true deities, even kings of angels and a number of angels would often not completely die. You should know very well that the apocalypse will come in another 10 or so years. I believe that the speed of the God of Combat's resurrection won't be fast enough. Klein attempted to awaken him with the cruel reality. Larian snorted. You will never be able to imagine the power of God. He didn't give Klein the chance to continue his persuasion and revealed a smile. In short, I won't make a deal with you. Pray to Evernight. Pray to the deity you believe in to seal 0-02 and save you. But all I need to do is wait another 30 to 40 seconds before I can leave this place. Klein looked up at the curtain, hanging from infinitely high above, and didn't say anything else. He made his spirit body return to the library where the Trunsoist brass book was. Do you have any ideas? He asked without any delay. Ariana shook her head slightly and asked, what did Larian say? He told us to pray to the deities to seal 0-02. As Klein spoke, he was suddenly stunned. What Larian said didn't seem to be problematic, but he had inadvertently revealed a very important piece of information. He believed that deities could seal 0-02, no matter who they were. Then, what does a deity rely on to seal it? By forcefully suppressing it with their sequence 0 status, or use a might that can destroy the world? Many questions appeared in Klein's mind. At this moment, Trunsoist brass book flipped to a blank page, producing silver words one after another. The language it used was the one on the first blasphemy slate. It seemed to be the source of all the languages that were still in use. In the blink of an eye, the silver words formed into new text. The Belton City Library is the place where the Trunsoist brass book is kept. It is a place that must be heavily protected. Living beings who intrude without the Trunsoist brass book's permission will be severely punished. It's an elevation of the punishment. I might be sentenced to death next. Klein's pupils dilated as he quickly deduced the most likely development. However, he didn't panic at all. Instead, he smiled and said with sincerity, "My wish is to shrink the size of the Belton City Library, so that the spot where Ma'am Ariana and I are is the boundary line." As soon as he finished speaking, he snapped his fingers and granted his own wish. As the snapping sound reverberated, the lawn that corresponded to the Belton City Library disappeared. The building shrunk and the walls retreated. Soon, only a tenth of its original size was left. Klein and Ariana subconsciously arrived outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Through the open window, they stared at the Trunsoist brass book that remained on the rectangular table. There was no change in the distance between them and the target. They were still very close, but they were no longer within the confines of being severely punished. However, due to their first violation of the curfew, they were once again whipped by an invisible law enforcer. After accumulating the wishes of restoring buildings one after another, Klein could create quite a miracle in this aspect. He didn't make another wish and continued thinking. He analyzed the hidden meaning behind the words of the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat. No, it shouldn't have been forcefully suppressed using a deity's status and level. Otherwise, my spiritual intuition would have told me the answer long ago. That would have made me activate Sapphira Castle's aura and complete the seal. From a mysticism point of view, this is understandable. This is because 0-02 is clearly related to a particular Sapphira. It's difficult to suppress it by relying on the status and level of a sequence 0. By relying on the might of the deities themselves? This might be possible, but there's a high chance that it's not the real method. This is because Larian knows of a sealing method that can be completed without relying on the deities. What's special about a sequence 0 deity? And what methods can an angel use to achieve such a special sealing method? The most special thing that I can think of at the moment is that a sequence 0 deity contains a uniqueness. This is something I can't summon from the historical void. It really has the characteristic of being unique. But how can an angel indirectly simulate a uniqueness? Countless thoughts collided in Klein's mind, producing large amounts of sparks, but he still couldn't figure out the key to the problem. At this moment, the mercury-colored words on the Trunsoist brass book continued to seep out, forming new paragraphs that stipulated that Klein and Ariana were a group of people that needed punishment. Ariana observed silently for a while before suddenly saying, "I'll try to conceal the soil beneath the table to make 0-02 fall to the core. Raise your level of alertness to prevent any accidents. Conceal the soil. Fall to the core." Klein's heart stirred. He felt that this was a rather good solution. The Trunsoist brass book had only forbidden the touching and changing its condition at present. The environment wasn't equivalent to its condition. In addition, they were only forbidden from entering Belton City Library. It didn't mean that Klein and Ariana couldn't exert certain influences on it. And when 0-02, which hadn't been banned from leaving, passed through the concealed soil and fell to the core, it would lose its influence on Belton City due to the distance, causing the laws it had set up to fail. That was the case unless it was awakened further or came to life, allowing a larger region to fall under its jurisdiction. This way, Klein and Ariana no longer needed to be restricted by the rules. They could seek help from the Evernight goddess. However, when Ariana finally thought of a solution and was preparing to carry out the plan, a new law was completely formed. The Belton City Library, the place where the Trunsoist brass book is stored. It is a place that must be strictly protected. No living thing or object is to deal any form of damage to it in any way. Indeed, 0-02 has also noticed this loophole. This loophole. As Klein frowned slightly, he suddenly had an idea of what he had been thinking about. The uniqueness of a sequence 0 deity was indeed unique, but their sealing of 0-02 wasn't directly done by using the authority and power that came from it. It was very likely that they could rely on this trait of a uniqueness to lure 0-02 into setting up a series of contradictory rules, causing the sealed artifact to fall into a paradoxical cycle. In this aspect, angels, saints, and even ordinary people could accomplish that by themselves. The key was to think of paradox and guide it into establishing it. As for how to seal 0-02 after it entered a paradoxical cycle and was preparing to fix the loophole, Klein didn't have any clues at the moment, so he needed to make further observations. How should I create a paradox? All the rules and regulations set up by 0-02 quickly flashed through Klein's mind. In just a few seconds, he acutely grasped a point where he could create a paradoxical cycle. He quickly turned his head and said to Ariana, "Ma'am, let's not destroy the city library. We will directly conceal the other parts of the Belton, indirectly causing it to lose the necessary support. This place will then collapse on its own, thus falling into the core." Ariana didn't immediately do as he said. Instead, she turned her head and gave Klein a deep look. "This will cause the deaths of many civilians. We have to make a choice between the lesser of two evils," Klein said seriously. Ariana didn't respond and fell silent. It was as though she was in an intense mental struggle or making the appropriate preparations. At this moment, the two brass pages that had just written the two articles quickly created more new rules. Belton is the city where the Trunsoist brass book is located, a true holy land in all senses of the phrase. No living thing or object is to deal any form of damage to it in any way. Upon seeing this text, Klein wasn't disappointed. Instead, he smiled. With a snap, he snapped his fingers, causing scarlet flames to surge out of his pocket and quickly drown him. In just 2 to 3 seconds, a stream of flames descended from the sky. Klein jumped out and carried a person. That was one of the 4 Beyonders he had saved previously. He was the Belton local, Biles. "Go in and quickly flip through the brass book," Klein said calmly as he pointed at the 0-02 on the rectangular table. Biles didn't know exactly what had happened, but he believed that this magical magician, who had fulfilled 2 of his wishes, had found a way out of the situation plaguing Belton. Thus, after taking a deep breath, he entered the city library through the miniaturized, open floor-to-ceiling windows. During this process, he didn't receive any severe punishments. In fact, he wasn't even whipped. Upon seeing this scene, Klein's smile widened. 0-02 had produced a paradox. Due to a Rhodes's existence, the Trunsoist brass book could only do a most comprehensive prohibition, preventing any living being or object from dealing any form of damage to it in any way. As a city, Belton's definition didn't just include its terrain and buildings. It definitely included the residents here. This way, if 0-02 punished a Belton citizen like Biles, any damage to him would go against the law it had just issued. If it didn't punish him, it would go against the laws that prohibited him from entering the city library. Hence, the Trunsoist brass book had entered a vicious cycle. Of course, Klein believed that such a paradox would quickly be corrected by appending additional clauses. He only hoped that Biles would be able to flip through the brass book and find clues to sealing it. Pay attention to the currently open page. Once an article is about to take shape, immediately come out, Klein instructed as he stared at Biles and 0-02. Chapter 1288 Key Intelligence. Although Biles had witnessed Phil's severed hand, Weber's hanging, and Mr. Magician's palm fused from worms, and also had a certain understanding of the horrifying anomaly brought about by 0-02, his lacking level and experience made him unaware of the true horror behind this matter. He mostly explained it away as a horror tale coming to life. Therefore, despite feeling afraid, he mustered up his courage and quickly approached the rectangular table under the watch of the magical magician and grounded angel. Of course, him being from the sailor pathway was partly responsible. Within 2 or 3 steps, Biles had reached a spot where he could touch the brass book. Without thinking, he reached out his right palm and grabbed the brass pages on 0-02 and quickly flipped them. During this process, the back of Biles's hand held up the brass page, which hadn't completely been filled, to prevent it from being blocked, so as to allow him, Mr. Magician, and Ma'am Angel to observe the changes on it and react in advance. Amidst the flipping sounds, this sailor saw the line that touching the Trunsoist brass book would result in the death sentence. He was first alarmed before he was filled with a strong sense of puzzlement about his current state. However, this didn't affect his action of flipping the pages forward. Klein's eyes reflected the different brass pages, and each page had different rules. The projections of these brass pages didn't appear by making lines disappear and having new ones substitute them. Instead, they appeared side by side and gradually increased in number. In the end, Klein's eyes reflected a different number of brass pages in them. They were neatly arranged, one line after another. It was as though he had split the 0-02 into a single page and placed it on a glass platform to bask in the sun. This was a dream divination technique at the angel level, allowing Klein to reproduce the scenes he had just seen before his very eyes. With the passage of time, The brass pages in his dark brown eyes began to spin and pinpoint one of them. The Trunsoist brass book originates from a justiciar uniqueness that had been corrupted by the nation of disorder. It's exactly as I expected. Since the Trunsoist brass book can produce all the low-level rules, the corresponding content must contain a description of itself. This is determined by its essence. Unless it completely awakens or comes alive, and has the sufficient intelligence to know how to selectively hide it. Just as a thought of joy flashed through Klein's mind, he saw a new word in mercury color appear on the unfilled brass page. This meant that 0-02 had finally diverted a portion of its power from its vicious cycle. It was preparing to add text as a supplementary explanation to fix the flaws. Leave! Without any hesitation, Klein shouted. Biles strictly obeyed the orders of a high-leveled figure, immediately withdrawing his right hand, turning around, and sprinting out the window. Make a move to attack me. Seeing that the sailor with dual attributes had left the city library, Klein suddenly added. Biles's heart was filled with puzzlement, but he still raised his right arm and pulled back his shoulder. He put on a stance that looked like he was about to throw a punch at Klein. At this moment, a new article finally took shape. With regards to the rules above, the Trunsoist brass book and the group of people it permits have immunity while enforcing the law. However, even if this article was successfully published, Biles wouldn't suffer any punishment. Clearly, the Trunsoist brass book wouldn't pursue problems that led to a vicious cycle or unclear definitions. It was just like how it didn't pile crimes on our roads after it mended the loopholes in the rules. By the same logic, Biles, who had truly come into contact with 0-02, didn't suffer any contamination from a Sapphira. Before the supplementary clauses were published, Biles was a part of the Belton. He couldn't be damaged in any sense, so he couldn't be corrupted. But with the additional clause, he wouldn't be retroactively punished for his previous actions. In fact, after Biles left the city library, he had violated the curfew order as well, but Klein had already noticed a problem. It was that when the Belton citizens pursued foreigners while outside, they weren't restricted by the curfew. Therefore, he made Biles attack him in a manner to avoid the corresponding punishment. Right on the heels of that, he seized the opportunity while 0-02 was fixing the loophole to quickly recall the detailed information regarding the Trunsoist brass book. This book possesses a living characteristic, but most of the time, it's at a very low level. The first half of the book displays almost all the underlying rules, while the second half is blank. It needs to be filled in autonomously. Once there are no restrictions, it will naturally set up laws with certain biases for the surrounding areas and strictly enforce it. During this process, it will change and correct the rules based on the feedback. As the law gradually becomes stricter, his living characteristic will deepen. Once a law that can interfere with all aspects takes form, the Trunsoist brass book will completely come alive. It will possess true intelligence, and has the ability to modify the first half of the underlying rules to a certain extent. The exact extent that it can reach is as follows. If there are contradictions in the laws that can't be corrected, or if the pages are all filled without being able to form a sufficiently airtight system of rules, the Trunsoist brass book will produce a new line at the boundary between the first and second half. All the following rules are ineffective. After this line takes form, the rules in the second half will disappear and the pages will return to a blank slate. After the second half is completely blank, the clause, all the following rules are ineffective, will be erased, and the Trunsoist brass book will repeat its previous actions until there is a set of laws that covers all aspects. The rules that it creates have to be publicized or informed to the masses before having them take effect. When there's no clear rule for a particular action, whether it's against the common knowledge of the surrounding living beings, Trunsoist brass book hates distorted and ugly rules. It hates having loopholes found. What a detailed description. There should be a method to seal 0-02 in all of this. Klein's thoughts raced as he attempted to find information that he could use from every line of text. At this moment, the leader of the ascetics, Ariana, whispered, "Think of a way to fill the pages behind 0-02, without making it airtight enough." That's right. In that case, the Trunsoist brass book will declare that all the following rules are ineffective. It'll redo it again. When that happens, its restrictions on the surroundings will temporarily vanish, allowing us to have the chance to touch it, take it away, or directly pray to a deity. But, how should we go about doing this? The Trunsoist brass book hates distorted and ugly rules. It hates having loopholes found. Klein's heart stirred as he had an idea. Without any hesitation, he stretched out his arms, as if he was hugging the air. In the next second, inside the building whose dimensions had shrunk to 1/10 of the original Belton City Library, a hall that was covered with deep black stone slabs with all kinds of scuffing descended into the real world. There were 8 black stone pillars erected in the hall, and metal poles hung from the high dome. At the bottom were candlesticks carved into different creatures, 41 on the left and 40 on the right. This was the Tudor Trunsoist United Empire's Hall of Consuls that Klein had seen before. At that time, both consuls were still Sequence 1 Princes of Abolition of the Black Emperor pathway, so this place was filled with distortions. It didn't match the normal circumstances and didn't have any rules of aesthetics. Apart from that, when Klein summoned this historical scene, he also used his domain's ability to add the details of the 4th epoch which he knew. It made the order that stemmed from the Black Emperor become more and more detailed, as though it was corporeal. Pah! His wrists were severed as they landed on the ground. Blood spurted out from the wound, just like an ordinary person. This was the second time Klein had committed fraud. The 2 palms and fresh blood that gushed to the ground quickly separated into transparent maggots and sticky, nearly shapeless liquid. As the worms of spirit convulsed and died, Klein grimaced due to the pain as he made numerous worms crawl out from the stump to form new palms. At the same time, he tried his best to maintain the scene he had created through multiple summonings, not letting it dissipate. On the rectangular table, inside the book that had bound brass pages, many new lines of text appeared. All buildings and structures have to follow the golden ratio and principles of symmetry. Strange clothes are not permitted. The following crimes have the death penalty. The Trunsoist brass book flipped through the pages quickly as it targeted the laws that stemmed from a Black Emperor. The further it went, the faster the new text appeared. There were no more pauses that lasted nearly a minute. Inside the hall, the candlesticks that fell from the ceiling broke and disappeared. Then, the other parts of the hall experienced various changes, wiping away the original details of the order one by one. Finally, the hall could no longer be maintained. It collapsed and returned to the historical void. At that moment, the Trunsoist brass book had already flipped to the last 2 pages. It was spread out there without any movement. With the last page filled with text and no longer able to form a tight system of rules with what 0-02 had previously set, Klein silently exhaled and relaxed a little. He felt that his spirituality was almost depleted. Let's wait for an hour at Biles's house. He turned his head and said to Ariana. If they stayed where they were, they would suffer increasingly severe punishments from breaking the curfew until they were sentenced to death. As for monitoring the Trunsoist brass book, this mission that couldn't allow for mistakes was naturally handed over to a Rhodes. Although this magic mirror couldn't directly look at 0-02, it could pay attention to the notice board and determine the disappearance progress of the laws on it. Chapter 1289 Fooling. After returning to Biles's house, Klein pulled a chair over and sat down without waiting for Roy and company to make inquiries. He made a rather pious wish. I wish for my spirituality to be restored. With that said, he raised his right hand, snapped his fingers, and granted his own wish, thus allowing his spirituality to return to its normal state. Right on the heels of that, he extended his left palm, preparing to end the maintenance of the historical projection of the curtain, before summoning a new one, so as to continue sealing off the spirit world area corresponding to Belton City. This prevented the Church of the God of Combat's chief shepherd, Larian, from escaping. There's no need to do so. There's always a next time. At that moment, Ariana slowly shook her head, indicating that Klein no longer needed to summon the curtain that originated from the dark demonic wolf. There was a limit to the power of wishes. A miracle invoker couldn't satisfy the same wish in a short period of time, which meant that, within the next 1 or 2 hours, Klein couldn't recover his spirituality by granting his own wishes. Of course, to a qualified seer pathway angel, this limitation was something that could be avoided. For example, he could get Pasha, Roy, Biles, and Ariana to take turns to wish for Klein to regain his spirituality before granting their wishes as a miracle invoker. However, the problem was that, even if he could recover his spirituality that many times, he wouldn't be able to maintain the curtain, which was at the level of a Sequence 1 for more than an hour. Furthermore, he needed to wait an hour before 0-02 erased all the previous rules and rewrote them. After some deliberation, Klein nodded slightly and replied with a smile, "Let's give it a try first. After all, we're rather free right now. I'll give up after my last spirituality recovery attempt. Yes, this will purely depend on the chief shepherd's luck." Perhaps he might lose control because of anxiety, frustration, and nervousness. As he spoke, Klein dispelled the maintenance of the original curtain, and his left hand moved forward immediately after that. He pulled out a new curtain, allowing it to appear inside the spirit world that corresponded to Belton City. In an area where saturated colors overlapped one another, Larian, who was wearing a black robe with white edges and a square hat, felt the restriction disappear. Just as he was about to make his way out, he saw a new curtain descend, sealing him off again. The smile on his face instantly froze. Phew. A few seconds later, Larian slowly exhaled and composed himself, mentally as he continued to wait. In the next hour, the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat repeatedly experienced the despair and pain of having his hopes extinguished. He attempted to find the pattern and attempt to figure out the time interval so as to grasp the fleeting opportunity. He wanted to rush out of the barrier the moment the old curtain disappeared and before the new curtain was produced. However, he eventually discovered that the intervals didn't follow any pattern. The person stopping him didn't restore the barrier only when his spirituality was about to be depleted. At times, the other party would recreate the barrier far ahead of time. If it wasn't for the fact that Phasacian citizens weren't forced to change faiths from the God of Combat, and that the decree that Larian was considered a traitor hadn't been widely spread, this grounded angel might have already lost control on the spot. As time passed, Larian once again sensed the collapse of the old curtain. However, this time, there was no new curtain. He has finally reached his limit. Larian was delighted. Without any hesitation, he rushed out of the collapsing nascent divine kingdom. In the next moment, he saw a woman holding 4 blonde red-eyed heads, dressed in a complicated long dress, an unknown existence that was wrapped in bandages with yellowish-brown liquid covering the entire, and several strange but abnormally powerful spirit world creatures. The curtain that Klein had summoned the previous times were historical void projections that had been tainted with Sapphira Castle's aura. It naturally attracted objects sensitive to it. He wouldn't even be surprised if a Mon was among the group. The smile on Larian's face froze again. Belton City, in Biles's rental apartment. Klein suddenly raised his head and looked up into the sky. He muttered softly, "Impressive." Following that, he became silent again until the magic mirror emitted an aqueous light that reflected the notice board's current state. The rules on the paper disappeared in reverse order of their appearance. This meant that 0-02 was beginning to erase the rules that it had set up, and was preparing to redo everything. Once the curfew order was abolished, the highly focused Klein immediately pulled Ma'am Ariana and used Flaming Jump to appear outside the shrunken Belton City Library. As he looked over, he realized that, on the brass pages of 0-02, the speed at which the rules were being wiped clear had become very fast. In just a blink of an eye, the second half of the book was only left with the clause, "All the following rules are ineffective." Following that, the clause disappeared as a new set of rules rapidly emerged without any gaps. The Trunsoist brass book is the most precious item. No living being is permitted to touch it. Before this clause was completed, Ariana's figure had already appeared beside the rectangular table. Her finger touched the brass page. With a crack, the leader of the Church of Evernights ascetic had her neck suddenly constricted as though an invisible rope had hoisted her up. As an angel, she had actually suffered bone fractures and had difficulties breathing. Death by hanging. However, with Ariana's finger sliding over with some difficulty, the first clause that appeared was erased, before it was fully displayed. It entered a concealed state. As for all the rules set by 0-02, it had to be publicized or announced before it could truly be effective. With a whoosh, Ariana picked up the Trunsoist brass book and threw it to Klein, who was outside the window. In the previous hour, Klein had already anticipated all the possible developments and had a discussion with Ariana. He was in no way nervous or flustered. While 0-02 was still in midair, he dragged another himself wearing a human-skinned glove out of the void. Then, he grabbed the Trunsoist brass book and used his historical projection to teleport away. After his figure disappeared from his spot, Ariana landed on the ground with a loud thud, a deep mark left on her neck. In just a few seconds, Klein, who was holding 0-02, appeared at the top of the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range. He used his spirit vision at the level of an angel and saw the collapsed, dilapidated, and fogged palace. Without any hesitation, Klein allowed his historical projection to take the Trunsoist brass book and blink to the main door of the palace before pushing the door open. What appeared before him was a hall with many corpses hanging from above. Every corpse was different. There were men and women, either dressed beautifully, simply, exquisitely, or casually. Behind each of these hangers was a transparent and slippery tentacle with complicated patterns. They came from the depths of the hall, from that ancient stone chair. On the huge stone chair, transparent and distorted maggots were formed into a ball. They grew wantonly and extended out strange tentacles. This was the half-fool of the Antigonus family, who had lost control and gone mad. Sensing the door open, and sensing Klein's historical projection approach, the cluster of maggots left the stone chair and fiercely flailed their slippery tentacles, causing them to surge towards the door as if they were being affected by an invisible suction force. Similarly, at the bottom of the stone chair, the tarot card with Roselle's image, which was written with a stellar radiance, flew towards the door. Just seeing this scene pushed Klein's historical projection towards experiencing a breakdown. Thankfully, he didn't possess any sentience and was remotely controlled by Klein. He didn't suffer the chaotic thoughts and the negative side effects of the mental mutation, nor did he stand motionless and helpless. Before the historical projection dissipated, it threw the Trunsoist brass book at the terrifying cluster of maggots. The transparent and slippery tentacles sensed danger and instinctively reacted by wrapping around sealed artifact 0-02. Under such interference and the invisible strong winds, the Fool card had reached the door one step ahead of the strange tentacles. Klein's historical projection had mostly collapsed. Seeing this, he mechanically extended his right hand, grabbed the card of blasphemy, and threw it behind him. In the next instant, the slippery tentacles that were reassembled had reached out to the door, but they were blocked by the fog, unable to exit. All it could do was wildly pound at the barrier. The open door slowly closed, blocking out this scene. Klein, who was hiding somewhere on the mountain peak, frowned slightly. He felt a sense of joy and relief, as well as a strong sense of doubt. In other words, I used 0-02 to exchange for the Fool's card? The goddess doesn't need me to seek clues regarding the river of eternal darkness for the time being? Klein silently muttered to himself. He walked out of the hidden area and arrived not far from the ancient palace. He bent down and picked up the card of blasphemy. On the surface of the card was Roselle Gustav, who was wearing colorful clothes and holding a stick and luggage. His eyes were filled with a longing for the future, and behind him was a puppy. On the upper left corner of the card, the resplendent stellar radiance outlined a few words, Sequence 0, the Fool. Inside the ancient palace, the Trunsoist brass book fell to the ground and opened up to the first page of the second half of the book. New rules began to form. The Trunsoist brass book is the most precious item. No living being is permitted to touch it. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. One is not allowed to change the condition of the Trunsoist brass book in any way. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. Just as the two rules just appeared, and before it could inform the owner here, a line of words suddenly appeared between the two halves of the book. All the following rules are ineffective. An hour later, the two rules were wiped out, and new rules were written. However, after just 2 lines, there was an additional clause in front of them. 0-02 seemed to have reached a blank slate that happened when the entire book was filled up. Again and again, the Trunsoist brass book fell into an endless cycle. Chapter 1290 Fulfilling Wishes. Putting away the Fool card, Klein took out Creeping Hunger from the void, equipped it to his left hand, and activated Teleport. After returning to the miniaturized city library, he immediately said to the servant of concealment, Ariana, "It has been thrown into the abandoned palace on the main peak of the Hornaces mountain range." That was an entrance to the foggy town. As for how to deal with 0-02 later on, it was the Church of Evernight's problem. All right. Ariana nodded and didn't say anything else. She entered a concealed state and vanished, as though she had been erased. She didn't thank him, nor mention any payment. It was just like how she had never made any requests when she helped Klein in the past. Does Ma'am Ariana know that I've obtained the Fool card? Klein looked around thoughtfully and slowly sighed in the darkness. Although the supernatural incident had been resolved in less than 2 hours, there were still quite a number of people who had lost their lives under the strict rules. The Belton citizens had more or less committed certain mistakes, but the punishments they suffered were far more disproportionate to the crimes they had committed. The most innocent party in the matter were the tourists who came or passed by Belton. They had to face a nightmare simply because they were foreigners. Klein had tried his best to do some things to protect many outsiders, including Roy and the others, but he was also limited in what he could do due to the restrictions he suffered. There weren't many loopholes that could be made use of, making it impossible to make it seem like none of that had ever happened. What I need to do next is to mainly provide treatment to the survivors. Klein retracted his gaze and planned on teleporting to Biles's house to deal with the remaining problems. At that moment, Rionette Tynker, who was holding 4 blonde red-eyed heads and was wearing a dark and complicated long dress, walked out of the void. One of the heads bit onto a black goat's horn. He escaped the spirit world, the remaining 3 heads of Miss Messenger said. As expected of a former chief shepherd. Klein, who had long sensed it, sighed without any surprise. Then he pointed at the black goat's horn. Did Larian leave that behind? After Klein received the item, Rionette Tynker's head that hadn't spoken earlier said, yes. After encountering the curse of deformity, he had still managed to barge out of the encirclement and escape from the spirit world. He is indeed powerful. Is this a Sequence 2 angel who's best at fighting head-on? Klein flicked his wrist, causing the black goat horn in his palm to shatter into countless tiny specks of light as it dissipated, dispersing the remnant psyche. The limbs left behind by a Beyonder after them undergoing a transformation contain a portion of their Beyonder characteristics that couldn't return to the main body. When the points of light were reassembled from Sequence 9 to Sequence 7, as well as a Sequence 4 Beyonder characteristic, Klein chose the Sequence 8 pugilist from it and returned the rest to Miss Messenger with a smile. These are your spoils. I'll only collect the intelligence fee. Rionette Tynker didn't stand on ceremony. She raised one of the blonde red-eyed heads and had it open its mouth, absorbing the Sequence 9, Sequence 7, and Sequence 4 Warrior Beyonder characteristics. After watching Miss Messenger leave Belton, Klein teleported back to Biles's home and smiled at Roy and company. The problem has been resolved. You are no longer foreigners who have to be treated with animosity. The 4 Beyonders were just about to respond with heartfelt and relieved smiles when they saw the magical Mr. Magician invite a stranger from the air. It was an old man with a dark red bow tie. He wore a shirt, vest, formal suit, and blue striped trousers. His hair remained thick despite it being all white. His aura was warm and elegant. This was the marionette, Vin Rambus, whom Klein had once possessed. He planned on using this manipulator to seal away their memories of 0-02. Not being corrupted by a Sapphira didn't mean that Biles wouldn't encounter terrifying matters when he recollected the matter. As there was only one relevant period of memory for Biles, and he didn't know the truth of the matter, what Klein needed to do was rather simple. Therefore, he didn't seek Miss Justice's help. He planned on using his marionette's historical void projection to complete it. You didn't tell them about what happened in the city library, right? Klein got Vin Rambus to walk to his side as he asked Biles. Biles hurriedly shook his head and said, I remember your advice. Very good. Next, I'll give you some psychological treatment. I'll help you forget all those matters. Otherwise, you'll be targeted by 0-02 and never be able to obtain peace until you die. Believe me, sealed artifacts at this level can definitely do something like that. Even if it has been taken away, Klein explained his goal frankly. Biles's lips quivered as he said, all right. He chose to obey and believe. After inviting Roy, Pasha, and Phil out of this rental apartment, Klein controlled Vin Rambus to do a series of mental control processes and successfully made Biles forget the brass book he had seen, as well as the contents on it. After doing this, Klein carefully took out the magic mirror and looked at it. Rhodes, are there any other hidden dangers? On the surface of the ancient silver mirror, the aqueous light flickered and reflected a line of silver words. Great Master, there aren't any latent risks in Belton. As for other places in Lone and Fay Sac, as it involves 0-02 itself, I'm unable to see it clearly. Perhaps you can confirm it yourself? All right. Klein nodded slightly, took out a gold coin, and softly chanted the corresponding divination statement. With a ping, the gold coin flicked up and tumbled in the air. During this process, scenes naturally surfaced in Klein's mind. They were chimneys, streets, and cities. They were extremely vague and lacked specific directions. With a slight frown, he collected his thoughts and reached out to catch the gold coin. Then, he got Pasha and the others to return to Biles's home. He smiled and said to Roy, Didn't you wish to obtain the next potion? You can make a wish now. Roy's eyes revealed surprise and he asked nervously, I can still make another wish? This is a gift, Klein replied with a smile. Roy's heart stirred. Without asking any more questions, he seized this opportunity to fulfill his wish of obtaining the next potion. Klein then threw the Warrior Pathways Sequence 8 Pugilist Beyonder characteristic to him. This is essentially a potion, but for safety, I suggest you search for the corresponding formula and find the correct supplementary ingredients. Your amazing feats are worthy of praise. Roy expressed his gratitude. His first potion had, in some sense, been a Warrior Beyonder characteristic that he devoured. As the apocalypse was approaching, along with his relatively low sequence and good luck, he didn't lose control on the spot. He didn't even have any serious psychological problems. After that, he gradually came into contact with other Beyonders and came into contact with true mysticism. Only then did he learn how dangerous his actions were, and he didn't dare make a similar attempt again. Faced with Roy's praise, Klein looked around and smiled. Next, follow me out of Belton. This doesn't mean that there's still danger here, but I have to make use of this time to fulfill your wishes. One wish involved Roy hoping that Klein could help them leave the Belton, while the other wish involved Pasha's wish to have Klein protect them and allow them to leave Belton City alive. Although these two matters were meaningless under the present situation, to Klein, he had to fulfill the wish even if there was no point in doing it. I'm just a heartless wish-granting machine. Klein lampooned himself as he smiled at Biles and company. Pasha and the others glanced at each other, not daring to raise any objections. Just like before, they held each other's hands. Then, Klein brought them to the outskirts of Belton with teleportation. The magic show has come to an end. It's time to say goodbye. Klein took off his hat and bowed. He tried his best to make himself a true wandering magician. This was a habit of his acting. Upon seeing this, Pasha blurted out, "Can we know your name?" Klein smiled and said, "I have too many names. Different people have different names for me. You can call me the miracle magician, Merlin Hermes." "Mr. Hermes, are you a believer of the Evernight goddess?" Roy asked after some hesitation. For a moment, Klein didn't know how to answer. He really wanted to say that he once was, but not anymore. After some consideration, he decided to act as an attendant of mysteries in advance. He immediately restrained his smile and solemnly said, "The one I serve is the Fool, the Lord of the Mysteries, the great ruler above the spirit world. If you wish to believe in this mighty existence, or wish to gain more of an understanding, you can go to the Sonia Sea's Rorsted Archipelago. The Lord's missionary, Danitz, is currently preaching there. Furthermore, the City of Silver definitely has all the potion formulas from the Warrior Pathway under Sequence 2. Klein silently added, but he didn't say it out loud. Roy nodded slightly and said, "It's my first time knowing of such a mighty existence in this world. Your miraculous nature has shown his brilliance." He didn't directly respond to Mr. Merlin Hermes because he was still hesitant. Pasha, Biles, and Phil were the same. Without another word, Klein turned around and left the four Beyonders, before making a detour to Belton. He didn't forget his purpose in alighting at this tiny city. He planned on immediately finding a room to study the Fool card above the grey fog. In a city in mid-seashire, at a particular library, a young law researcher took out a book from the bookshelf and walked to a table by the window and sat down. As he carefully read through the book, he realized that there was a page of yellowish-brown paper in it. "What is this?" The young law researcher muttered to himself in confusion and reached out to pull out the paper. After confirming that it was written in ancient Fey Sac, the content was rather rare. In the fourth epoch, there was a book named the Trunsoist Brass Book. On the one hand, I know a lot of ancient secrets and have lit up many historical fragments. On the other hand, I can directly influence the fog of history through Sapphira Castle. I'll put the fool's matter aside for now. Currently, my focus is on Attendant of Mysteries. You have to walk one step at a time before running is possible. Of course some lucky ones can fly directly. It's very easy to find the 9 specialties in the spirit world. Be it to get Miss Messenger to help, or to seek the Seven Lights advice, this isn't a problem. The advancement ritual is very close to the environment around Zeratul and the Antigonus family's ancestor. Furthermore, it matches what the Seven Lights said about having a close connection with the spirit world. I can determine it to be true for now. With this in mind, Klein took off the topaz pendant wrapped around his left wrist and used divination to confirm the authenticity of the Attendant of Mysteries potion formula. It wasn't that he didn't believe in Emperor Roselle, but his fellow countrymen had likely been influenced by Mr. Dorr before he created the cards of blasphemy. He had gone to the moon and suffered the corruption and contamination of the mother goddess of depravity, thus resulting in distorted memories. It was precisely because of this that it was highly possible that Roselle had buried some traps in the key areas of the cards of blasphemy in his final days. In this aspect, Klein had always been cautious and careful. Speaking of the primordial moon's true form, the most powerful Great Old One, the mother goddess of depravity, could it be that the emperor had unknowingly been tainted based on her title? On the moon, perhaps there are many younger brothers and sisters that Bernadette has never met before. Of course, it's unlikely that there are gender differences. The marionettes needed for the Attendant of Mysteries ritual can be obtained from the forsaken land of the gods. The copious number of monsters there is a good thing. Furthermore, I've accumulated quite a few of them previously. As Klein's thoughts wandered, he turned his head to look at the other side of the ancient palace and made the grayish-white fog beside the junk pile dissipate. As the fog receded, rows of brownish-yellow seats appeared, each of which sat a figure. Those figures were either giants covered in silver armor, humans with deformed facial features in linen clothes, and large chunks of flesh overgrown with eyes. They sat quietly in their rows of seats, their eyes glazed over and indifferent as they stared in the direction of the long mottled table. These were all marionettes that Klein had gathered in the forsaken land of the gods. Every time he needed to switch location, and it wasn't convenient for him to carry too many with him, he would sacrifice a batch of them above the gray fog. Of course, this had nothing to do with environmental protection. Instead, it was what had happened to the foggy town and the scene displayed by Zeratul. It made Klein instinctively believe that there was a high chance that a particular ritual would require many marionettes. Therefore, he had always been very frugal in this aspect. As for why he didn't hang these marionettes up, and had made them sit in rows in a conjured theater as members of the audience, this was because Klein felt that the actions of the Antigonus family's ancestor and Zeratul were a little perverse. He had tried to imitate and mimic them, but the goal was for acting. Now, he didn't need it anymore. But how can such a marionette city produce corresponding spirit world information? The spirit world is a gathering of the past, present, and future information, but it doesn't directly include such fake objects. Generated from what others know? Every living being's actions and words would be reflected in the spirit world in an abstract manner, becoming the source of divination. When their actions, words, and certain intense feelings are clearly built into a marionette city, the city's spirit world projection would appear, turning into a true existence. The interactions involved in this are linked to the more profound secrets of the spirit world. Klein closed the Fool card in thought and played with it. As he had already reached the angel level, he had a certain understanding regarding the creation of the cards of blasphemy. Back then, not only was Roselle able to draw powers from knowledge, but he could also give actual powers to abstract knowledge. As for what kind of material the Emperor used to create it, and how he accomplished the effects of anti-divination and anti-prophecy at the level of deities, Klein was unable to figure it out. After some thought, Klein tried to accommodate the Fool card in his body. His condition immediately changed. His body was covered with colorful clothes, and there was an extremely gorgeous piece of headwear on his head. His aura was deep and terrifying, but it gave off a comical, ridiculous, ludicrous feeling. It was a condition filled with a strange conflict. The space attached to Sapphira Castle gently swayed, as though it wanted to surrender to the feet of this indescribable deity. My level has been enhanced a little. There aren't any substantial changes. After all, I'm already the owner of Sapphira Castle. Heh. It's like I have a fashionable costume that can accentuate my aura. Klein shook his head and said a few self-deprecating words. At the same time, a transparent and distorted worm of spirit crawled out from his body, forming a figure that was identical to him. After splitting off a worm of spirit of himself that could respond to prayers at any moment, Klein returned to the real world and strolled around Belton City. He used the method of granting wishes to treat the injuries of people, and he learned about the war from them. Dogs hit. Danitz couldn't help but curse when he heard the crew's report. They actually finished the whale oil? Why didn't you stop them? As they passed by the Gargas archipelago, Danitz and his crew bought a batch of whale oil that hadn't been refined. They planned on bringing it back to Byam and selling it at a high price. Who would have expected that a portion of it had been secretly eaten by the City of Silver's half-giants? The crew member glanced at the oracle and whispered, "They don't understand what we're talking about." "We don't understand what they're talking about either. Only the shortest one can communicate, but it doesn't mean we can find him at any time. He always cogitates in places where the sun shines, changing positions every time." Danitz subconsciously sneered. This is what happens to illiterates. If you could grasp all sorts of languages like ancient Faesak, Jotun, and Elvish like me, something like that wouldn't have happened. Of course, linguistic talent is related to intelligence. You don't have to force yourself. The crewman carefully looked at Danitz again. "Oracle, they ate the portion of whale oil you bought." "Dogs hit." Danitz's reaction was faster than his thoughts as he rushed towards the cabin. After a period of chaos, Danitz received compensation with a Sequence 8 Beyonder characteristic. He didn't know if he had profited or suffered a loss. After all, the dirty bodily fluids left on the characteristic made him feel disgusted and nauseous. By the time the ship returned to peace, City of Generosity, Byam, was already in front of the City of Silver's reconnaissance team. Derek led Lievel, Candace, and the others to the deck and looked at the destination of their journey. Although they had passed by many ports, they had never been allowed to alight from the ship. They could only watch from afar. Now, it was finally time for them to step onto the land outside. Even so, the large number of people, houses, and hardships that they had seen from afar were still unable to conceal their bubbling enthusiasm. They continued to yearn for life in the world of light. Of course, having been used to the darkness and lightning, they took quite some time before they could get used to the sun outside. If not for the fact that they were Beyonders, they would have suffered permanent damage to their eyes. As he looked at the docks and the numerous people, the airships that were traveling high in the sky, and the other ships around him while hearing noises that he could barely understand, Derek suddenly felt a sense of nervousness. This would be the area where the City of Silver would take up residence in the future. As he swept his gaze, he suddenly saw a man standing on the coastal lighthouse. He was wearing a long robe embroidered with the symbol of storm. His hair was dark blue, nearly black, like a clump of seaweed. His face was rough and carved. As their gazes met, Derek instantly calmed down and no longer felt uneasy. Chapter 1292. Entering Byam for the first time after the huge ship belonging to the Resistance docked, all of the City of Silver citizens changed into round-neck shirts, brown jackets, pantaloons, and dark-colored caps before following Oracle Danitz down the ship. They prepared to pass through the dock to enter the City of Generosity Byam. Those clothes had been prepared beforehand. "It's really uncomfortable wearing this. It's not suitable for battle." As he walked, Lievel moved his limbs and whispered to Elder Derek. Derek nodded slightly and said, "But it's better to hide ourselves and not be too eye-catching. We don't want to become the focus of attention." Derek's analysis wasn't a problem at all. After all, they were outsiders and they only numbered 21 people. It was best if they didn't attract the attention of others, but he seemed to have forgotten a crucial detail. But they're all looking at us." Candace quickly surveyed the area and whispered. The workers who were dressed crudely or half-naked at the pier all looked over at the tourists who wore all kinds of get-ups. "They're tall." A Byam resident with bronze skin and slightly curly hair could not help but sigh. His height was only around 160. This was the height of all the male commoners in the current colonial era. As for the people of the City of Silver, other than Derek, who was only slightly over 2 meters tall, the rest were on average above 2.3 meters. The tallest of them exceeded 2.5 meters. To have such half-giants walk through the docks amidst the crowd was equally eye-catching no matter what they wore. Faceations. A Loanese in a top hat and formal suit turned his head to gossip with his companion. Has the slave trade begun again? He believed that the City of Silver entourage were Faceation slaves that the Rorsted government had bought from the Lone Kingdom. After all, in this world, the only ones he could think of who had such heights and such numbers were the barbarians who claimed to be descendants of giants. His partner shook his head and frowned. It doesn't seem like the case. Most Faceations have light blue eyes. Furthermore, even if they are Faceation, few of them exceed 2 meters in height. Unless these are nobles or high-ranking prisoners of war. Although Faceac didn't have a clear rule, in all kinds of industries, especially in the military, there was a phenomenon that one's height determined one's status. Of course, this wasn't the only condition. It was also a combination of family background, nobility, and ranks. Due to such traditions, the The descendants of Phaeacian royalty and the military brass were generally taller than 2 meters. This was actually a superficial phenomenon that, at its essence, was an influence of their beyonder characteristics. Those who became one of the brass of the Phaeacian military were either nobles or at least sequence 5. And for the latter, due to the repeated influence of the giant pathways potions, their height would definitely reach the standard height. Those who chose the Red Priest pathway would also have a certain increase in height. However, the signs weren't as obvious in their early stages as those from the giant pathway, and the total increase in height was only a few centimeters. They had to become a demigod to experience a qualitative change. 4 noble descendants, their ancestors were more or less giants, or had marital alliances with giants. Regardless of whether they inherited the beyonder characteristics, the corresponding genes accumulated over generations would definitely allow their normal height to exceed 2 meters. Among them, families who were still in control of a portion of the giant pathways potion formulas, and those who had a certain heritage, tend to be in the same situation as the residents of the City of Silver. The royal family in charge of the Red Priest pathway maintained the heights of their descendants through marital alliances. The residents of the City of Silver, who were being scrutinized by numerous gazes, felt increasingly uneasy. It was as if they had returned to the cursed land where they were being watched by monsters as they walked in the dark. Derek was very calm and composed. He looked around and said to the members of the reconnaissance team, "They don't have any ill intentions." After confirming that Mr. Hanged Man was in this city and how he knew that he had arrived, Derek no longer felt isolated and helpless. It wasn't that he didn't trust the messenger that Mr. Fool had appointed, but that he believed that he didn't want to trouble a god as much as possible in his daily life. The best thing to do was resolve problems himself. And when it came to dealing with his own problems, Derek was ultimately unfamiliar with the outside world, so he wasn't too confident. At this moment, to have an experienced, trustable, extremely intelligent native with a meticulous mind help him would definitely be the best option. Of course, Derek also knew that Mr. Hanged Man wouldn't make any contact with him on the surface because he belonged to another faction. He wasn't a believer of Sea God, so if he acted too warmly over matters regarding the City of Silver, he was bound to be suspected. However, there will always be a proper reason and suitable opportunities to meet. Derek thought in anticipation. Amidst his thoughts, he and the members of the City of Silver's reconnaissance team followed Danitz out of the dock and arrived on the streets. Their vision suddenly broadened as they saw more people than before and heard all sorts of voices. To the people of the City of Silver, this was even more lively than the grandest harvest in their hometown. At a glance, there were countless people dressed in strange clothes with all kinds of unique characteristics. Some were in a hurry, others were strolling leisurely, and some were carrying large pieces of fruit. They used pipes to suck in the liquid, or held food that looked like the delicious pies on the ship, occasionally taking a bite. Apart from these, horse-like creatures that pulled carriages producing tinkling sounds, the metallic objects that moved extremely fast, and the smell of the various spices that filled the streets made people of the City of Silver feel like they had come to another world. And to them, this was indeed another world. Even though they were a little fearful and uneasy, and were not too used to such a scene, everyone could clearly feel the vibrancy of this scene. This was like the sunlight in one's soul, reflecting the sun in the sky. This is the place where we will live, battle, and reproduce in the future? Derek, Lievel, Candace, and the others subconsciously had similar thoughts. They felt a little uneasy but didn't reject any of it. Danitz looked at their faces which had been stunned silly by Byam's bustling scene in satisfaction as he inwardly muttered, "This is only Byam. If you were to go to Trier and Backlund, are you going to kneel down and kiss the ground?" This world-famous pirate controlled his urge to mock them, as he was now Mr. Fool's messenger. He couldn't ruin the image of a deity. After leading the City of Silver people to a rather luxurious hotel, Danitz gestured for the crew to handle the check-in as he spoke in fluent Jotun to his guests. "It's getting dark. We'll stay here for one night and leave the city tomorrow. The place where you will build your city has been arranged. It's on the other side of the forest. There's a natural harbor and a few roads that lead to Byam. Roads to this city. After that, we'll expand the main road and build a railway that leads to your city." Railway. Derek, who had studied during the tarot gathering, knew what it meant. He nodded gratefully and inwardly praised Mr. Fool once again. Danitz continued, "We've already helped you level the area, and left the space needed for some basic facilities such as water pipes and gas pipes. When you begin building houses, we'll send a team over to help with the matters. Also, the corresponding construction materials and temporary tents have been prepared for you. Thank Mr. Fool.
There's also the help of the Church of the Lord of Storms in this matter.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to purchase so much material. However, they mainly did so to earn additional funds. The Rorsted new government hadn't been established for long, and its connections with the outside world weren't comprehensive enough. What they didn't expect was that the Church of the Lord of Storms had taken the initiative to provide help on the City of Silver's matter. Water pipes. Gas pipes. Derek gradually couldn't understand what was being said, but he still put on a pensive expression. There were a few times when Danitz nearly said the word, "dog's hit," in passing. Without speaking another word, he introduced the hotel. This is a hotel that Phasacians like to live in at Byam the most. The ceiling might be a little too low for you, but it won't be low enough to hit your heads. With that said, Danitz smiled.
At the end of this street is Red Theatre. He revealed a smile that all men understood.
However, the people of the City of Silver didn't understand. Seriously, the Emperor said that the most ancient human occupation is the selling of their bodies. They actually don't know what I'm talking about. The corners of Danitz's mouth twitched as he gave up on the topic. After his second and third mates were done with the check-in, he led the entourage up to the second floor and assigned them their rooms.
After doing this, he took out a stack of cards that he had long written, and he distributed them to the members of the City of Silver, who were scouting the area.
Every card has a few words in the local language and the corresponding word in Jotun. If you need any services or food, you can ring the bell here. When the attendant comes over, show him the card. Of course, they might not be able to understand it, but they will definitely seek help from people who understand it. This was a simple and easy method to understand. The people of the City of Silver easily grasped how to use the cards, secretly excited that they could finally communicate with the people here. Following that, Danitz demonstrated how to switch on the water and how to use the toilet, and how to light up the gas wall lamps. It made Derek, Lievel, and Candace feel like they had arrived at a divine kingdom. All it took to have water flow was to press a switch. A button was enough to wash away their excrement without leaving any stains. There was a lantern that kept emitting light once it was ignited. These were all things that they didn't dare to imagine in the past. And these things would become part of their new lives. By the time the City of Silver's members had gotten used to the hotel, the sky had completely darkened. Night had begun to rule the city. Although Derek and company had long confirmed that there was no danger of monsters attacking in the dark in the outside world, they were still instinctively afraid. Therefore, they would either emit light themselves or light up the gas wall lamps. At that moment, they saw gas lamps lighting up one after another on the streets, the houses, both near and far, outside the glass windows. These lights dispersed the darkness in their respective areas.
In the eyes of the people of the City of Silver, the bright and dim lights were like the galaxy landing on the ground at night.
Chapter 1293 Devil's Oil Painting in a warehouse that was being rebuilt in Pritz Harbor. Furs met her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, once again a few days later. "Are you ready?" Dorian asked in a low voice.
Back when they met, he had already informed Furs of the ritual requirement of the Apprentice Pathway Sequence for Secret Sorcerer, so that she could make advanced preparations.
"More or less. I should be able to satisfy the requirements," Furs replied without much confidence. The advancement ritual of a secret sorcerer was relatively simple, but in this case, simple was the antonym for complex, and not difficult. To Furs, she wished that it was something else. The ritual required the candidate to seal a demigod-level creature with clear animosity. The less external help one received, the better the ritual's effects. As for the target's level, as long as it wasn't lower than a demigod, it was fine. It had virtually no effect on the ritual. Upon hearing that, Dorian nodded and said, "That should be fine. That ritual is really difficult for a Sequence 5 Beyonder to complete it on their own. It's necessary to seek help at appropriate times, but you mustn't go overboard, such as exceeding the corresponding limitations. Otherwise, the ritual will definitely fail." The suggestion he had previously provided to Furs was to borrow a Grade 1 sealed artifact. It would be best if she didn't even hire a saint-level helper.
Furs said vaguely, "I only plan on making a wish to Mr. Fool to increase the success rate of advancement after consuming the potion."
This is closer to obtaining good luck when consuming the potion, rather than being blessed and protected while sealing the demigod creature. Other than that, I'll be using the painting that you mentioned. The painting wasn't a Grade 0 sealed artifact, the Scroll of God, but the Abraham family's Grade 1 sealed artifact. It was called Devil's Oil Painting. In the fourth epoch, when many members of the Abraham family had advanced to Sequence 4 Secret Sorcerer, they had created the oil painting to seal the corresponding demigod-level creatures. However, after being attacked by the Aurora Order and losing a lot of documents, Dorian Gray wasn't sure how many terrifying creatures were sealed in the Devil's Oil Painting. He was only certain that there was definitely more than one sealed inside. His original plan was to release a demigod-level creature that was completely insane from the Devil's Oil Painting, one that acted purely out of instinct. This could then be his student's ritual target. This made it much easier than dealing with a rational and intelligent saint. Furthermore, it was completely in line with the ritual's requirements, but he never expected Furs to directly borrow the Devil's Oil Painting. Dorian frowned and reminded her, the Devil's Oil Painting only has the effect of imprisonment and sealing. It doesn't have the ability to actively affect the target. In other words, you have to stuff a demigod-level creature into the Devil's Oil Painting. Furs nodded, indicating that she knew this. Teacher, you mentioned that one's record ability isn't considered external help. Yes, Dorian Gray gave a definite answer. If her record powers were considered external help, almost no traveler could advance. After all, record was the core ability of the apprentice pathway before they became demigods. Once it was excluded, Furs would be left only with the means to flee, making it difficult for her to do anything to her enemies. In theory, that's the case. However, you can only record at most 5 demigod-level powers, Dorian said worriedly. Before he finished his sentence, he thought of Mr. Fool and his blessed and felt a little more at ease. If the powers are matched well, it isn't impossible for me to succeed. It's just a mad creature that's acting on instinct. Furs tried convincing both her teacher and herself. Dorian nodded indiscernibly and didn't say anything else. He immediately summoned his contracted creature, Malmouth, who loved music, and took out the secret sorcerer mane and supplementary ingredients. He then concocted a bottle of secret sorcerer potion for his student. If there's no way to complete the seal, there's no need to forcefully consume it. Even if the potion and glass bottle fuses together and turns into a sealed artifact, we can also pray to Mr. Fool to restore it to a beyonder characteristic. Dorian continued to warn her worriedly before handing the potion to Furs. Inside the glass bottle were layers of stellar radiance, as though the Milky Way in the sky had been sucked into the potion. All right. Furs nodded heavily, indicating that she wasn't worried that the potion would be wasted. She had made plans ahead of time. She would immediately teleport away once she realized she couldn't seal the released demigod-level creature before making a wish to Mr. Fool and getting him to resolve it. Dorian then took out an oil painting from his suitcase, which was filled with abstract images. It was an image that no one could understand. Just looking at it would make one feel dizzy and mentally weak. This was the Devil's Oil Painting that had sealed countless terrifying creatures. If you can successfully advance, I only have one request. Dorian held the Devil's Oil Painting and said solemnly to Furs, that is, on the night of the full moon, listen to what Mr. Dorr is saying and ask him the reasons for his actions. The members of the Abraham family still couldn't fully accept that the curse they had suffered from had stemmed from their ancestor. They felt that Mr. Dorr might not know the consequences of his plea for help. They wished to figure out the full truth. All right. Faced with her teacher's sincere request, Furs agreed without any hesitation. Following that, she took the Devil's Oil Painting, teleported out of Pritz Harbor, and came to a vast desert where no humans lived. This way, even if an accident happened during the ritual, she had plenty of time to resolve it and not affect ordinary people. After checking the surroundings and preparing herself, Furs inserted the Devil's Oil Painting into the ground. She then clasped her hands together and bowed her head to pray to Mr. Fool. She wished that he could increase her chances of advancing after consuming the potion. Without any pause, she saw the illusory grayish-white fog and knew that Mr. Fool had already responded. After stalling for a few seconds, Furs finally convinced herself. She took out the herbal powder she had prepared, and she scattered it on the Devil's Oil Painting. Then, she recited the incantation to release the seal in Jotun. This was an incantation that only released one creature. Without a sound, the powder that was floating in the air landed on the oil painting and rapidly spun around a central point. As it spun, The surface of the oil painting turned illusory as if a deep vortex was forming. Suddenly, a bluish-black hand emerged from the vortex, one that showed signs of decay. It stretched out from the oil painting to the outside world. Furza's body suddenly turned cold as though she had fallen into a frozen lake. While clearing up her mind, it also made her seem to lose control of her body. No matter how hard she tried, she was unable to move her limbs. At that moment, Furz seemed to return to her past state of writing books at night and sleeping during the day. At that time, she often felt that she had woken up, but she couldn't move at all. It was as though she was being pressed down by an invisible creature. Although the terrifying creature in the devil's oil painting had yet to fully escape, its influence on the outside world with its godhood made Furz lose most of her ability to resist. Once it fully escapes from the oil painting, Furz would even lose control merely from looking at it directly. The difference between the two in their lives' natural order was unimaginable in certain aspects. Gradually, Furza's consciousness blurred a little, having a nagging feeling that she was already lucid. She raised her arm and moved her feet, but on second thought, she realized that it was only her imagination. As her body turned colder, the feeling of being pressed down by an invisible creature became more obvious. Fortunately, she had a bunch of demigods providing her information, allowing her to close her eyes in time. She didn't look at the devil's oil painting. Otherwise, the consequences would be dire. Using cogitation to maintain a certain level of clarity, Furz began counting down. According to Mr. World's warning, she knew that the terrifying creature would need 5 seconds to completely escape the devil's oil painting. 4, 3, 2. With just 1 second left, an illusory book appeared in Furza's eyes. It quickly flipped and stopped on one page. 1. Just as Furz finished counting, she suddenly spread open her arms. Around her, peach blossoms fell in a colorful resplendence. The bluish-black hand that was about to grab her neck moved away from her, and was blocked by the peach forest that was blooming with vegetation and flowers. It was separated by a mountain that was the forest's river source, making it only possible for it to enter through a small cave. This was a fairy tale magic Furz had recorded from Mam Hermit. It was called Peach Blossom Source. It could create an isolation barrier from the outside world, making it very difficult for the outside world to connect to it. Seizing this opportunity, Furz, who barely managed to regain control of her body, took out a queen chess piece from Roselle's chest from a pocket and threw it at the source of the peach blossom scene, throwing it at the cave that penetrated through the flowing river. This was another fairy tale magic she had recorded, called the chessboard of time. Its effect was to slow the target's movements, as though it had entered a region in which time flowed slower. With a smack, the actions of the bluish-black palm that was trying hard to break through the peach blossom source changed from extending outwards to squirming. Furz didn't even look at the effects. She used an invisible hand to pick up the devil's oil painting that was stuck in the sand, and she held it right up to the cave. After 1 or 2 seconds, the bluish-black palm returned to normal. Its movements became extremely fast as it charged out of the peach blossom source and crashed into the oil painting. As the oil painting shook, the terrifying creature penetrated the surface and landed in it. Furz was delighted. Without any hesitation, she recited the incantation and closed the outer seal of the devil's oil painting. Thankfully, that demigod creature has already lost control. It's left with nothing but madness and lacks intelligence. I wonder if I will directly hear Mr. Door's shouts after consuming the potion. Still nervous, Furz took out the secret sorcerer potion bottle and poured it into her mouth. Chapter 1294 Conversation. If that demigod creature didn't slam into the devil's oil painting on its own accord, I'd have to summon Mr. World's historical void projection. I wonder if that can be considered as directly hiring a helper at the angel level. As Furz pondered, she drank the potion. To her, the potion was like icy water that could hurt someone due to the extreme temperature. All her senses vanished in the areas that it passed, leaving only her still thoughts. It was inevitable that a person would hallucinate in extreme cold temperatures. In Furz's vision, a night sky instantly appeared. It was dotted with countless stars that weaved together to form a dreamlike river. Furz's body began reflecting bits of stellar radiance as if they came from her own body. The tiny bits of pure stellar radiance formed an invisible connection with the different stars in the night sky. As the light shimmered, they twisted and squirmed as insect-like creatures crawled out of Furz's body. They wanted to seek refuge in the Milky Way formed by an array of embedded diamond shards. Each of them carried a portion of their own flesh and consciousness, as though they were uncontrollable avatars. Furza's thoughts quickly turned chaotic, and she fell into confusion. She almost couldn't control the urge to separate herself. At that moment, she sensed an illusory object. It was the seal that she had completed using the devil's oil painting. It was projected into the mysterious world created by the potion, forming an abstract, blurry mark. Furz didn't think further as she instinctively extended a portion of her consciousness along with her spirituality, and intertwined with the abstract symbol. The mark wasn't exactly harmonious with her, as if it wasn't part of her, but it managed to barely merge with her. Suddenly, in Furz's mind, the abstract symbol became rather clear. It consisted of a door that was layered with mysterious symbols. This door hid Furz behind it, allowing her to isolate herself from the surrounding cosmos. At the same time, on the other side of the door, the sealed creature seemed to sense the aura of an enemy. Using its own godhood, it wildly corroded the illusory door. It happened to be able to reduce the influence the cosmos had on Furz. After maintaining it for more than 10 seconds, the resplendent Milky Way's night sky slowly faded away.
The stellar radiance then returned to Furz's body fused with her.
At this moment, a deep darkness appeared in front of Furz. Deep in the darkness was a perpetual storm and occasionally flashing lightning. The next second, Furz heard a familiar voice. It stabbed into her head like steel nails, stirring her brain matter. Furz grimaced immediately.
If she hadn't experienced such things over and over in the past, and had some level of resistance, as well as the fact that she was at the saint level, she would have likely lost control.
Of course, there had to be some influence of good luck here. After a few seconds, she finally managed to calm herself down and hear what the voice was shouting by using cogitation. It was calling for help. It wasn't Jotun, Elvish or ancient Hermes. Instead, it was a language that Furz had never come into contact with before. However, she could understand it the moment she heard it. She felt like it was the true source of many languages. Mr. Door would crazily shout for help every full moon. How disgraceful of a king of angels. However, even if he is seeking help, it's still a terrifying thing that I can't withstand. Furz lampooned silently.
She was considering if she should pretend not to hear it and wait until she had converged her spirituality and grasped the beyonder powers of a secret sorcerer before conversing with Mr. Door during the next full moon, or to do it now.
Suddenly, the shouts from afar stopped and the surroundings became deathly silent. After 2 to 3 seconds, a wispy voice that could pierce through spirit bodies entered Furz's mind. You used the beyonder characteristics of the Abraham family.
This sentence was said in a flat manner without any rise or fall, but it made the blood vessels on Furz's forehead throb.
Her eyes turned bloodshot as her body turned resplendent. She almost lost control of herself. Who are you? Furz composed herself and asked deliberately.
The voice that seemed to lure her into losing control said in a low smiling voice, You can call me Mr. Door.
You should be familiar with me. The King of Angels from the 4th epoch directly pointed out that Furz had a certain connection with him. She could hear the full moon ravings. I'm going to write you into a novel.
Furz secretly gritted her teeth and asked, Honorable Mr. Door, are you the ancestor of the Abraham family, Your Excellency Bethel?
The voice that had crossed countless barriers returned to its flatness. Yes. Then, do you know that your cry for help has caused the entire Abraham family to be trapped in a curse that has lasted for more than 1,000 years? It's basically impossible for anyone to become a traveler or even a scribe. They often lose control during advancements or the night of the full moon. Furz felt that she couldn't speak to Mr. Door for a long time. Otherwise, her inclination towards losing control would be irreversible. She directly posed the question that the Abrahams were most concerned about.
Mr. Door fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, They no longer have secret sorcerer or demigods?
There aren't any after the War of the 4 Emperors.
And the curse you brought has made it impossible for them to advance to a demigod.
If you can stop crying for help for 10 years, a new Abraham demigod might be born. This will greatly aid in your escape, Furz sincerely suggested.
Mr. Door sighed and said, I have been exiled to an eternal darkness, and suffer the blockage of a perpetual storm.
I have no way to know what's happening in the real world, nor did I expect that there isn't a single demigod left in the entire Abraham family.
Lies.
The one who calmly made this conclusion wasn't Furz, but rather Klein, who had accommodated the fool's card as he held the staff of the stars while sitting in Sapphira Castle. He had been closely monitoring the corresponding crimson star.
He remembered that the Emperor had mentioned in his diary that Mr. Dorr had a certain understanding of reality.
He seemed to be able to use the changes brought about by the full moon to see the situation outside the seal.
After sighing, Mr. Dorr continued, "Besides, I can't control the cries for help during the full moon."
"Why?" Furs asked in surprise.
Mr. Dorr said in an ethereal voice, "You're already a demigod, so you should know very well that the higher the sequence, the greater the threat of going mad.
An ordinary angel, even those who can walk the land freely and do what they like, without needing to engage in any additional battles, could also be gradually influenced by the Beyonder characteristics and become less like themselves. They might even enter a half-crazy state. I'm a king of angels who has been exiled and sealed for more than 1,000 years, and I don't even have someone to communicate with. My not going crazy means that I'm sufficiently powerful and lucky. On each full moon, the madness in me will be strengthened. I can't control it and can only constantly call for help. So that's how it is. If I were locked up like this, I might have gone crazy in a few months. If I'm provided alcohol, newspapers, magazines, all kinds of books, and various delicacies, I can last a year. No, half a year." Furs nodded in enlightenment and asked in a perfunctory manner, "Is there anything I can do for you? How can the Abrahams dispel the curse?" Mr. Dorr fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "Set up a ritual and help me escape. That way, the curse will cease to exist. There are 2 rituals that can be used. One is to sacrifice 3 demigods that are respectively from the seer, apprentice, and marauder pathway. The other is to extract the blood of at least 99 Beyonders from the Abraham family."
"Use it to draw such a symbol?" "I'll tell them," Furs immediately replied. At the same time, she added inwardly, "That's if Mr. Fool permits it." Mr. Dorr laughed and said, "If I can escape because of this, I will help you become an angel." His voice became more ethereal and weaker, as though he was slowly returning to his original state as Furs' advancement came to an end. About 2 to 3 seconds later, Furs couldn't hear the sounds that slowly pushed her onto the path of losing control. The deep darkness and horrifying storms in front of her also vanished. However, before the scene completely faded away, Furs could vaguely see that, on a vast land formed from dark red rocks, there was an ancient building that resembled a pyramid erected there. Behind the building was a deep darkness and twinkling stars. It was completely different from the cosmos that she had seen as an astrologer on the ground. "What's this?" Furs shook her head and controlled her scattered thoughts as she began to carefully rein her spirituality back. After getting accustomed to the state of a secret sorcerer, she immediately took on a praying posture and reported her previous experiences to Mr. Fool without missing anything. After doing this, Furs put away the devil's oil painting, teleported back to Pritz Harbor, and met her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, who was waiting in the warehouse. Seeing that his student was safe and sound, Dorian heaved a sigh of relief and said in a pious manner, "Thanks to Mr. Fool for his blessings." He had finally taught a Sequence 4 secret sorcerer who didn't show signs of betrayal. Due to Mr. Fool's lack of response, Furs didn't inform her teacher of her conversation with Mr. Dorr. She planned on waiting until the next full moon. She also relaxed and smiled. "Apart from thanking Mr. Fool, I have to thank you, teacher." In the ancient palace above the fog, Klein didn't have any doubts about Mr. Dorr calling himself half crazy. He only felt that there had to be more secrets hidden in the matter. For example, why did Mr. Dorr keep enticing Emperor Roselle to visit the moon? It was a place that was occupied by an outer deity. After some thought, he took out the Scarlet Lunar Corona and Master Key from the fog of history. He planned on creating a full moon environment and listening to Mr. Dorr's shouting. The effects of the combination had long been confirmed. Klein quickly heard the voice that seemed to pierce through his spirit body. The content of the shouting was, "Don't save me! Don't save me!" Chapter 1295 The Aftermath from the War's Frontlines. "Don't save me! Don't save me!" Being located in Sapphira Castle and having accommodated the Fool's Card, Klein already had the status of a king of angels. He no longer suffered any direct corruption from Mr. Dorr's cries, but the contents of the cries made his scalp tingle. His pupils dilated, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of horror surging in his heart. He originally believed that Mr. Dorr was constantly shouting for help, but what he heard now was, "Don't save me!" Amidst Klein's silence, the weak, wispy voice pierced through his spirit body like needles. After shouting for more than 10 seconds, it suddenly changed. "Help me!
Help me. This time, there was a certain change in the language used.
Klein expressionlessly leaned back into his chair and listened for nearly 10 seconds. Following that, he removed his control over the master key and the scarlet lunar corona's historical void projection, allowing the atmosphere of the space above the gray fog to completely return to silence.
Phew.
He exhaled as he tapped the edge of the long-modeled table out of habit and muttered to himself, Mr. Door is indeed half mad, but the mad part isn't the him who is desperately screaming, but the him who appears calm, the one that's able to communicate with people rationally. The latter can influence the former to a certain extent, distorting the contents of his shouts. When Mr. Door is lucid, he actually shouts, "Don't save me." To a king of angels who had been imprisoned for more than 1,000 years, this definitely isn't a normal reaction. Unless he feels that he will bring a disaster that he doesn't wish to see upon returning to reality. A king of angels that has completely lost control? Together with Mr. Door's communication with the Emperor, and how he had been constantly enticing him to visit the moon which is occupied by an outer deity. There is another possibility to this matter. Mr. Door, who was exiled, lost the protection left behind by the original creator. He encountered the corruption of a particular outer deity and lost most of his rationality. His condition is only slightly better than the chained god.
The apprentice pathway can wander the cosmos at sequence 3. Mr. Door's honorific name also includes the title of Guide of the Endless Cosmos. Does this mean that before this king of angels was exiled, he might have already made contact with outer deities and came under some influence? Yes. What does Miss Magician's final glimpse of the Crimson Land, pyramid-like buildings, and cosmos in a different area represent? This doesn't seem like it's in the current solar system, but it's a little different from the mausoleum that a Black Emperor needs.
It's the lair of some outer deity who affected Mr. Door. Or should I say that when Mr.
Door became a planeswalker and left legends behind on other planets with living beings, this is one of his anchor points? It's highly likely the latter, because when Miss Magician saw this scene, she didn't encounter any corruption from the cosmos. The more Klein thought about it, the heavier his heart became.
This was because it was possible that this was a reflection of how the apocalypse would dawn.
The apocalypse was definitely not something that wouldn't happen by not thinking about it or pretending not to know. It's no wonder Yellow Light Venathan had prophesied that the day when the curse is removed is the beginning of the true disaster for the Abrahams. Mr. Door keeps calling for help, causing the Abraham family to be unable to produce another demigod. Perhaps it's a certain form of protection. Although this will make the Abraham family lose their status and most precious items, making them mediocre, it can at least save their bloodline. Heh. In the prophecy, the solution to resolving the curse is in the hands of an apprentice who has obtained the help of a secret existence. Klein chuckled softly and had an idea about the response to give Miss Magician. He planned on getting Furs to give a half-truth when informing her teacher. Firstly, it was to emphasize that Mr. Door was already half-crazy and extremely dangerous. Even communicating with him implied tremendous risks. Secondly, it was to not mention the second ritual for the curse removal. All she would say was about the sacrificing of a seer, a marauder, and an apprentice demigod. With the first point, the Abrahams could understand why their ancestor was insistent on calling for help. This was because he had already lost his mind and could do all sorts of terrifying things. This could effectively eliminate the anxiety of the Abrahams, preventing them from helping Mr. Door escape, and allowing them to quickly start believing in the fool. The second point was to dispel the small number of extreme Abrahams who wanted to try their luck. This was because they lacked the ability to complete such a ritual.
At the same time, informing the Abrahams of the ritual increased the trust they had in Furs.
Ignoring the small number of secret sorcerers available, those who can become bizarro sorcerers are definitely very difficult to capture. Furthermore, most of them are concentrated in the secret order. To deal with them is to provoke Zeratul. Even if the Abrahams have a demigod, and can use a grade 0 sealed artifact for a short period of time, it's impossible for them to complete the ritual so easily. Yes, dealing with a parasite is the most dangerous. If they aren't careful, they might end up targeting Amon's avatar. When that happens, it will be equivalent to serving Amon desserts. Also, I'll use the world's Gehrman Sparrow in the future to remind Miss Magician to keep her guard up against the Abraham family's extremists. Klein thought for a moment before replying Furz's prayer. After returning from the fog of history to the real world, Klein boarded a steam locomotive and arrived at the capital of Mid-Seashire. In the past, it was the second largest city in Lone, and also the front line of the recent war, Constant City. The damage suffered here is very serious. After getting off the train and leaving the platform, Klein stood up high and looked at the industrial city. Although it was his first time here, he had seen all sorts of pictures of Constant in newspapers and magazines. Those photos were all black and white, and they recorded the various aspects of the city. Among them, there were 3 points that left a deep impression on Klein. Firstly, it was filled with chimneys and tall blast furnaces.
It was as though it was a man-made forest.
It gave a striking visual impact, one that was more representative of industry than Backlund. Secondly, the majority of the buildings used concrete and steel. They were more densely built than their counterparts in Backlund. Thirdly, there were many places that were stained with coal ashes, including the bodies of humans, but the air quality was better than Backlund because the sea breeze was strong. And now, the towering blast furnaces, chimneys, and tall buildings had become rather sparse. All that was left was a pile of ruins. However, in comparison, the damage dealt to the factory district was lesser than the residential areas. This was because there were many steel and military factories that were equally important to Fasak. The death toll here is definitely more than 100,000. Klein sighed inwardly. He carried his luggage and walked down the stairs to the steam locomotive station and entered Constant City.
On the way to the hotel, he continued his acting as a miracle invoker and randomly chose a young, burly man in his 30s.
I'm a wandering magician. My best magic trick is to grant anyone's wishes. Do you want to try it? The previously thin-skinned Klein was now able to strike up a conversation naturally.
The burly man glanced at him and waved his hand impatiently.
Can you let my father, mother, 2 brothers, and a child be revived? With that said, he didn't wait for the magician to respond as he walked towards the nearest public carriage station in a slightly irritable manner. He struck his left chest with his right fist.
Klein stood where he was and maintained the smile on his lips as he quietly watched the man leave.
He recalled a magazine he had read on a steam locomotive. It contained several pages of images reflecting the current state of each cemetery in Constant City. The tombstones were similar to the original chimneys and blast furnaces. The racks that held up urns of ashes resembled tall buildings that had collapsed. The entirety of Constant City seemed to be buried in a cemetery. Retracting his smile, Klein walked around the already dried-up fountain and walked to a nearby inn. Along the way, he heard many pedestrians discussing haunted places and the places with terrifying monsters. When I was passing by the Maris River, I heard a lot of people crying in the water.
I didn't dare to look and ran back into the city like the wind. That's nothing.
I saw something even scarier on 9 Hyacinth Street. There was a face plastered on the window there. A very pale face. A few passers-by disappeared behind my house, and the blood continued all the way to the nearest ruin, but the police couldn't find the bodies. How terrifying. May the goddess bless us. Holy Lord of Storms. Let these ghosts and monsters stay away from us. By the way, City Hall has posted an announcement that we are to report it to the police the moment such things are discovered. From the looks of it, the meat grinder-like war made it impossible to placate many corpses, allowing them to turn into ghosts. Most of the time, some of the dead might not even have their bodies left intact. Yes, there are definitely many Beyonders who lost control due to a mental breakdown or from losing their limbs. Also, most of those who didn't consume the potion according to the normal procedures also easily lose control. The Nighthawks and mandated punishers will definitely clear up these matters, but at least in Constant City, people might have encountered plenty of Beyonder matters for quite a long period of time. After all, some ghosts and monsters are good at evasion and hiding. They are innately very cunning. Klein walked straight and gained a new understanding of Constant's situation. Here, encountering supernatural events was no longer a coincidence. Instead, it was a daily occurrence with a certain probability. At this moment, Klein saw a group of Nighthawks wearing red gloves and black trench coats walk across the crossroad ahead of him. However, he didn't recognize any of them. Indeed, the Cathedral of Serenity has sent the Red Gloves team to help. What's happening nearby?
Klein nodded indiscernibly and, following his spiritual intuition, cast his gaze to a particular apartment building behind a pile of ruins. On the 4th floor, behind an oriel window, a greatly rotting face was plastered to the window, looking out through the glass. Pale yellow liquid with black hints slid down the window one after another.
Chapter 1296. Amateur astronomer Eric had become a captain of a Red Gloves team during the later stages of the war, as well as advancing to Sequence 5 Spirit Warlock. He had witnessed the deaths of the ex-captain and ex-ex-captain. He knew that a higher sequence wasn't a guarantee that he would be safer. Care and caution was what mattered. To the elite Red Gloves of the Nighthawks, this was a concept that almost everyone believed in. This was because ordinary Nighthawks might only encounter ordinary problems that looked like supernatural events. Occasionally, there would be slip-ups, and it was highly likely that they would rely on their Beyonder powers to turn the situation around. As for Red Gloves who worked on various important cases, their hidden targets were definitely rather dangerous. At that moment, Eric stood on the 4th floor of the apartment on 14 Priya Street. Facing the tightly shut dark brown wooden door, he surveyed the area and said, "2 Nighthawks have already gone missing here. We must not be careless." Initially, several residents of this apartment block reported it to the police. They claimed that Unit 403 had a stench, and the tenants of Unit 303 often heard heavy footsteps from above. The policeman in charge of the area took 2 days before coming to investigate. However, they didn't walk out of Unit 403. After the police confirmed this, they immediately transferred the case to the Church of Evernight. However, the 2 Nighthawks who came to deal with it also disappeared. The door to Unit 403 remained tightly shut. Due to this premise, the Church of Evernight's Archbishop of the Mid-Seashire Diocese entrusted the matter to Eric's team and allowed them to apply for a Grade 1 sealed artifact as support. "Yes, Captain." The members of the Red Gloves team either nodded or spoke in response. Eric didn't say anything else as he stood in front of the dark brown door of Unit 403, which remained tightly shut. He raised his red-gloved left hand and knocked on one of his teeth. A blurry figure suddenly appeared in front of him. As though it had no substance to it, it passed through the gap in the door and entered Unit 403. Eric's expression was unusually focused, as if he was observing the situation in the room through that blurry figure. It was a natural spirit that he controlled. It wasn't especially powerful, but it had special abilities. It usually lived on his left front tooth. Under the current situation, Eric believed that they shouldn't barge in directly. It was best to do reconnaissance first. Even if his team had a good mix of powers and a powerful sealed artifact to help them, they had to be cautious. If he could figure out the situation inside and prepare for it in a targeted fashion, he believed that things would be much easier. Right at this moment, tiny blood vessels protruded in Eric's eyes, and some of them even exploded. When his vision turned bright red, Eric heard a heavy creak. The dark brown door suddenly opened. There were a total of 6 figures in the room. 3 police officers wore black and white uniforms. They were sitting on high-back chairs, high stools, and the sofa. 2 of them were wearing half-top hats, black trench coats, of which one was standing by the door, and the other was standing behind the oriel window. His face was pressed to the surface of the glass as if he was watching the streets downstairs. There was also a figure sitting on a high stool at the edge of the balcony. In front of him was an exquisite astronomical telescope. The skin of the 6 figures began to swell, as though they had been injected with gas. Some parts of the body had even cracked and were highly decomposed, but they still hadn't dried up. They exuded a bluish-black glisten as light yellow liquid with hints of black flowed out. Sensing the door open, the 6 figures turned to look at Eric and the others. The first was the Nighthawk standing in front of the door. The last was the man wearing a cotton shirt behind the astronomical telescope. He had one of his eyeballs, its blacks and whites separated clearly, glued to the telescope's lens, allowing him to only use his remaining black empty socket to scan the Red Gloves team outside. A faint stench drilled into the noses of Eric and the others as an indescribable coldness filled the surroundings. Eric instinctively raised his hand to hit his teeth, releasing more spirits. Then, he used his Nightmare Beyonder powers to forcefully drag all his targets into a dream. However, no matter how he tapped his teeth, he didn't release his soul. His Spirit Warlock Beyonder powers seemed to have vanished instantly. At the same time, a nightmare in the Red Gloves team also discovered in surprise that he was unable to pull someone into a dream. At that moment, apart from the enhancement in their physique brought by the potion, their Beyonder powers mysteriously vanished. "Leave this place," Eric ordered without hesitation. He had never encountered such a strange situation before. All he could do was get the team to retreat first before choosing a sealed artifact to handle the situation in a targeted manner. However, he and his team members didn't move despite his orders. It was as though their bodies were no longer taking orders. Eric instinctively lowered his head and looked at his lower body. His legs were swollen and his pants were torn. In addition, he could clearly feel that his skin was decaying, rotting, and running with pus. He and his Red Gloves team had yet to truly come into contact with their target, but they had fallen into a nightmare of watching themselves die, swell, and rot bit by bit with no way to escape. Right at this moment, Eric's bloodshot eyes reflected a normal palm. He held the handle and gently pulled it. Thud. The dark brown door of Unit 403 closed once again, separating Eric and his Red Gloves team from the creatures in the room. They instantly regained control over their bodies. However, their legs seemed to have suffered significant injuries. It was a little difficult to move them, be it raising their feet or bending their knees. Eric didn't bother checking on his injuries. He quickly cast his gaze on the palm that closed the door, and its owner. It was a young man wearing an ancient hat and a long black robe. His facial features were ordinary, making it impossible for one to have a deep impression of him. It was a face that one forgot in seconds. I sincerely advise you to return now and leave the matter to the Archbishop or high-ranking deacons to handle. Of course, you have another choice. That is to ask me to grant a wish. I'm a wandering magician named Merlin Hermes. My specialty is granting the wishes of others. Klein spared no effort in enticing others to make a wish. When he saw the rotting face on the oriel window earlier, he suddenly had an ominous feeling, so he specially came over to confirm what had happened. Grant wishes. Eric recalled the education he had received during his training in the Holy Cathedral. A high-sequence beyonder might be in a state of being imprisoned or sealed. They will pretend to be mystical items that can grant wishes, and they will entice you into helping them escape. The corresponding examples include granting 3 wishes and wishing pools. Is this a high-sequence beyonder? But he doesn't look like he's imprisoned or sealed. Eric looked left and right and deliberated for a few seconds before probing. If we don't ask you to grant us our wishes, will you not resolve the abnormality in the room? As soon as he finished speaking, he saw the wandering magician who called himself Merlin Hermes fall deep in thought, looking a little troubled. A few seconds later, Klein raised his hand to stroke his tall top hat. He smiled and sighed. Even if you don't make the wish, I will still attempt to resolve it. Do I need to read your honorific name or your true name to have my wish granted? Eric asked after exchanging glances with his team members. Klein shook his head. No, just tell me your wish. This wouldn't create a mysticism connection. Eric probed in a joking tone. Then I wish the abnormalities in this room will be resolved and will no longer affect the surroundings. Klein curled his smile and gently clapped his hands. Your wish will come true. Without waiting for Eric to respond, he smiled and said, the abnormalities inside can suppress beyonder characteristics, causing the corresponding powers to be ineffective, but that isn't absolute. Typically in such cases, my suggestion is. As he spoke, Klein reached out with his left hand and took out an eyeball-shaped glass ball. He then twisted the handle with his right hand, opening the door a little. Then through a crack, he threw the glass ball into Unit 403. As the glass ball flew, it constantly absorbed the surrounding light and gave off a brilliant, pure, extreme sunlight that resembled a miniature sun. The next second, Klein closed the door with his right palm, lest Eric and company's eyes couldn't take it. My suggestion is to use a Grade 1 sealed artifact in the sun domain to purify the entire area. While saying that, Klein recalled the mutated sun sacred emblem behind Tingen City's Chinese gate. Although it was only a Grade 3 sealed artifact, it could still deal with the rotting creatures inside given enough time. Just as Eric was about to say that they had brought a similar sealed artifact, but just didn't have the chance to use it, he saw Mr. Merlin Hermes open the door to Unit 403. The 6 figures inside had vanished into thin air, and the different beyonder characteristics were slowly condensing. The originally cold and sinister stench had been completely melted by the warm feeling. It's been resolved? Eric asked after some hesitation. Klein shook his head with a smile. No, the root of the problem is still here. Have you investigated the owner of this place? Eric replied immediately. He calls himself John, an amateur astronomer. He likes to study the cosmos using specialized telescopes at night. Studying the cosmos. Klein walked into the room without batting an eyelid, and he casually instructed, search the area and find any possible clues. For some reason, Eric suddenly felt that Mr. Merlin Hermes was the captain from back when he first joined the Nighthawks. He was professional, calm, and trustworthy. He nodded at his team members, signaling them to follow his instructions. As for him, he continued following Klein. It was both to provide him help, and also for necessary precautions.
Klein ignored him as he swept his gaze and approached the exquisite astronomical telescope. Then, he bent down and drew his eyes towards the lens.
This might be dangerous. Eric had planned to warn him, but he fell silent when he thought about how high the other party's level and status expressed. At that moment, through the telescope, Klein saw a resplendent, dreamlike dark night sky. Every star there was blinking slightly. Suddenly, his vision was occupied by a huge eye.
The eye seemed to be directly attached to the lens on the other end of the telescope.
It was grayish-white with a pale yellow iris. Veins swelled outwards and seeped out disgusting translucent pus. Chapter 1297 Forest of Miracles Boom. The Red Gloves captain, Eric, shivered involuntarily as he saw Merlin Hermes, who claimed to be a wandering magician, explode behind the telescope. However, there was no splattering blood or flesh. The shredded limbs disappeared into the air like soap bubbles. Eric and his team members, who looked over due to the commotion, were stunned. They didn't understand the reason behind such a sudden sequence of events. A second later, Eric said in a deep voice, "Retreat." He wanted to evacuate his team before the danger truly spread. At this moment, another figure walked in from the open door of Unit 403. It was none other than Merlin Hermes, who had just exploded. This wandering magician was wearing a tall hat and a long black robe. As if nothing had happened, he spoke to Eric and his team members. "The root of the problem really is from that telescope." As he spoke, Klein walked to the balcony and tapped the telescope with his right hand.
Another bang rang out as the telescope suddenly shattered into metallic points of light that emitted a foul stench of bluish-black gas.
The moment the grayish-white fog appeared, the stench vanished and the room returned to normal. What exactly happened? Eric forced himself to forget about the other party's death and asked cautiously.
As a captain of the Red Gloves who was rather experienced, he had some guesses about the truth of the matter.
The main goal of asking was to seek confirmation. Klein smiled and said, "Simply put, the telescope mutated for some reason, causing the owner of the room to see something that he shouldn't have seen. If you want to understand more details, you can only search for clues yourself." "I'm not too sure either." Eric nodded slightly and cast his gaze at his team members, signaling them to continue their investigation. After a series of work, Eric said to Merlin Hermes, "There aren't many clues left in the room. We can only confirm a few things. 1. John is a local resident, and he served in the military during the war. It seems that he had some mental problems as a result. 2. He had been an amateur astronomer. At the end of the war, he joined an academic organization known as the Celestial Research Association, but we didn't obtain any information about this organization. 3. John was seeking the way to see the true cosmos." Upon mentioning the word cosmos, Eric paused slightly, as though he had received a warning from the upper echelons of the Church of Evernight. He joined an organization known as the Celestial Research Association after the war ended. Sought the way to see the true cosmos. Klein combined this knowledge with his experience, and had a certain level of confidence in the matter. He nodded and said, "You should know that the cosmos means danger. You can't even try to understand it. We will report this case to the Archbishop as soon as possible and classify the Celestial Research Association as a dangerous organization," Eric said as if speaking to a Nighthawk superior who wasn't directly in charge of him. Klein didn't respond as he walked to the door and sighed. Indeed, war really does have an irreversible impact on all aspects. After the fall of the god of combat, the already crumbling barrier set up by the Primordial One lost parts of its support. As for the Evernight goddess, she has yet to fully gain control of the corresponding uniquenesses. As for becoming a great old one, who knows how much longer that will take. Under such circumstances, the intrusion of the outer deities into this world would naturally deepen. This is combined with the damage that many ordinary people have suffered from the war. Klein suspected that, during the subsequent period of rebuilding after the war, many cults that pointed to the different outer deities or cosmos would appear secretly in Lone. If he allowed them to spread their faith and attempt various risky attempts, the apocalypse would definitely be brought forward. As he sighed, he walked out of Unit 403. His figure blurred, turning transparent until he disappeared. In a hotel near Priya Street, Klein, who had long since moved in, picked up the coffee in front of him and took a sip. Taking advantage of the fact that it was still early, he went out once again and took a carriage to the outskirts of the coastal Constant City. There was a cemetery. The stone tablet stood erect like a short forest. Klein walked through the cemetery and found a tombstone with the help of his spirituality. The name on the tombstone wrote, Welch McGovern. This was the original Klein's university schoolmate. As he had bought the Antigonus family's notebook, he had mysteriously died in Tianjin. This had indirectly caused Zhou Mingrue to transmigrate. Welch McGovern's father was a banker in Constant City. He had spent money to bring his son's corpse back to his hometown and buried it in this cemetery. Klein stared at the photo on the tombstone for a few seconds.
He bent down and placed the bouquet of white flowers in his hand in front of Welch's grave.
Just as he was about to turn and leave, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. 20 to 30 seconds later, an old man with a black cane walked over from another direction. Klein recognized him and knew that he was Welch's father. He was the Mid-Seashire County banker who had once invited him and his schoolmates to a sumptuous meal. However, compared to a few years ago, this gentleman had aged significantly. He was originally a very energetic middle-aged gentleman, but now, his hair was half white. There were many wrinkles on his eyes, mouth, and forehead.
"Who are you?"
Welch's father looked at the stranger in front of the grave. He asked, puzzled and wary.
Klein sighed and said, "Mr. McGovern, I'm Welch's friend.
I just happened to pass by Constant City recently." Welch's father nodded slightly and said in a deep voice, "He's a very sociable person. I only know a number of his friends." His words were an attempt to explain why he hadn't invited Klein to the funeral and how sorry he was. Klein didn't say anything else as he looked around and said, "Is there anything you need help with? Or do you have any wishes that you wish to have fulfilled? I hope I can provide you with some strength." Welch's father looked around and smiled bitterly. "Can you allow all the dead here to stand up again? It's not impossible, but they will be different from what you have in mind." Klein sighed and shook his head. "Then can you allow Constant to return to its original state?" Welch's father asked with a bitter smile.
Without waiting for Klein's reply, he sighed and continued, "There's no need to provide any help.
I can achieve what is possible myself. If it's impossible, then I can only pray to the deities." As he spoke, the banker went past Klein and walked to his son's tombstone. He bent down and put down the bouquet of white flowers. Klein looked at his back and muttered to himself, "I will try my best." With that, he turned around and left the cemetery. Constant City, in a bar with a style that resembled the previous centuries. A man donning a thick jacket carried his beer and walked to a wooden board beside the bar counter. He tried to find a part-time job on the notices pasted on it. Suddenly, he saw a strange mission. "I'm a reporter. I want to gather all kinds of stories from different people. It's best if you had personally experienced it yourself. The remuneration I can provide is to satisfy your wish to repair and rebuild your house for free. I have sufficient resources in this aspect." Merlin Hermes. The man subconsciously frowned. He felt that this request was too strange, like it was a prank. "Can you read the words on it?" A thin man who was sitting beside the wooden board took the opportunity to ask. Few patrons of this bar were literate. Even if they wanted to find a job, or accept the corresponding commissions, most people were unable to understand the notices on the wooden board, and the bartender could only remember the few with the highest pay. As a result of this situation, the thin, feeble man relied on the common Loanese terms he learned at the free schools to provide the corresponding interpretation at a quarter pence. This was how he made a living. The man shook his head, indicating that he understood Loanese. He pointed at Merlin Hermes' request and said, "Is this real?" "It is. That reporter is sitting by that corner, the one wearing a very tall hat." The thin, feeble man enthusiastically pointed him in the correct direction. The reporter had promised him a quarter pence for every person he introduced. The man holding the beer fell silent. After hesitating for a full 10 seconds, he walked to the corner and found the reporter named Merlin Hermes. Will you really help me rebuild my house?" he asked worriedly. Klein pointed at the documents on the small round table and said, "We can sign a contract." "There's no need. Even if you provide some materials, I'll still be very satisfied." The man sat opposite Klein and said rather cautiously, "I don't have a very touching story. As long as it's real enough." Klein nodded slightly in encouragement. The man looked down and stared at the table. I'm a constant native, and I used to have a decent job. I bought a terrace house along Loteed Street. Later war broke out. My house was reduced to ruins during one of the bombings. My eldest son, the child who just entered primary school, was buried inside. We had no choice but to rent a 2-bedroom room until the Phasacians occupied Constant. They dragged my wife away and she never returned. Some time ago, someone requested me to identify her corpse. I couldn't even recognize her. She had rotten so much that you wouldn't even call it a corpse. However, in the pockets of her clothes, there was still our old water bill. When she was still at the rental apartment, she had always missed our home. It's the same for my younger daughter. I don't have much money now and can only barely maintain my life, but I wish to rebuild that house bit by bit. To be honest, I don't like telling others about my misfortune. I'd rather stay silent. But if I can really get help with the rebuilding efforts, then I can. Klein held a pen and paper and pretended to jot it down.
He nodded gently and said, "Your wish will come true.
Wait for me in front of the ruins of that house on Loteed Street tomorrow." At the same time, he pushed a 1 solely note over. "This is for your drinks. My treat." The man's eyes flickered. He seemed to want to refuse it, but in the end, he still picked up the note. The next day, after sending his younger daughter to the church school, he walked along the familiar path to the familiar Loteed Street and saw that familiar house. Its chimney, its windows, its door, and the weeds on its walls hadn't changed at all. It was so familiar, as if its beautiful female owner would open the door in the next second and walk the 2 children out to welcome their father. The man was stunned, unable to believe that this was real. However, even if it was an illusion, he was willing to embrace it. After several days, Klein, who had completed a slew of similar wishes, pushed open the window of the hotel and snapped his fingers in the morning light fog. In an area of the city overlooking Constant, Welch's father woke up out of habit due to his dreams of his dead son and family. He walked to the balcony to take in the morning air. Under the light of dawn, he suddenly saw chimneys and blast furnaces that resembled a forest. Alongside them were tall buildings. The former Constant City had presented itself to him, bathed in the orange light of dawn. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.